The Sahara today is widely perceived as the very archetype of desolation, an expanse of sand dunes, scorched earth, and silent wind, covering approximately 9.2 million square kilometers. It evokes images of emptiness, timelessness, and uninhabitability. This image, perpetuated through schoolbooks, media portrayals, and scientific generalizations, has come to define the Western conception of the desert. Yet, beneath the arid crust of this perception lies a problem long ignored. What if this vast region, now deemed lifeless, was once a nexus of culture, complexity, and connectivity? What if this emptiness is not an eternal condition, but a recent transformation, and more disturbingly, a deliberate erasure? In the mid-20th century, early paleoenvironmental studies began to suggest that the Sahara was not always a desert. The finding of ancient lakebeds, fossilized aquatic fauna, and traces of vegetation contradicted the assumption of its perpetual aridity. These were not isolated anomalies. By the 1980s, a more systematic accumulation of sediment cores, isotopic analysis, and paleoclimatological data confirmed the existence of an epoch called the African Humid Period, during which the Sahara was green, habitable, and populated. Still, while climatologists slowly rewrote the ecological history of the region, deeper question remained marginal: who lived there, and what was lost? Conventional archaeology has long privileged riverine and coastal civilizations as the engines of complexity. Egypt along the Nile, Mesopotamia along the Tigris-Euphrates, and the Indus Valley along its namesake. Civilizational development, in this paradigm, is framed as a function of geographic determinism. Rivers feed agriculture. Agriculture enables surplus, and surplus allows for cities, writing, and hierarchy. The Sahara, lacking these river systems, is conveniently excluded. Yet this exclusion is circular. It assumes the absence of civilization based on ecological readings post-desertification, while failing to critically examine what came before. The sands dot throughout the 20th and early 21st century. Fragmentary discoveries have challenged this vacuum. Rock art in Tassili Nasr depicting domesticated cattle, large gatherings, and ceremonial masks. Subterranean irrigation tunnels in the Fezzan region, attributed to the Garamantes. Megalithic structures in Niger and Algeria with alignments suggesting astronomical knowledge. Mysterious tumuli scattered across southern Libya and Mauritania, in patterns suggesting organized burial systems. Taken individually, these finds are fascinating. Taken collectively, they imply something far more radical: a deep-time human presence in the Sahara with social structures, cosmologies, and technological adaptations that defy the conventional model. However, these implications remain largely buried under layers of historiographical silence. The academic treatment of the Sahara remains fragmented. Climatologists rarely speak to archaeologists, and both often ignore anthropologists or oral historians. Moreover, there is an epistemological inertia embedded in global historical narratives. Civilization is still framed in a manner that privileges the visibly monumental, the literate, and the agriculturally intensive. What doesn't fit? This mold is either labeled pre-civilizational or reclassified as peripheral. The Sahara, not entirely agricultural, often pastoralist, and frequently lacking durable monumental architecture, fails the criteria set by the very definitions it might contest. Political interests have also played a role in maintaining this void. Colonial-era expeditions were driven by strategic or economic goals, not historical curiosity. When artifacts were found, they were often misattributed or extracted without context, shipped to European museums where their interpretation was subject to racialized assumptions of African backwardness. Post-colonial regimes, meanwhile, have had little incentive to reconstruct pre-Islamic, pre-Arab, or pre-state pasts. In many cases, acknowledging these forgotten layers would threaten national narratives of unity origin, and continuity. What remains is a double erasure. By sand and by ideology, there is also a methodological challenge. Much of the Sahara's pre-desertification evidence lies buried under meters of sand, beyond the reach of traditional archaeological methods. Where excavation is possible, preservation is poor due to extreme thermal fluctuation. Carbon dating is hampered by organic scarcity. Even satellite imagery, though promising, is limited by the resolution and interpretative frameworks of its users. As a result, knowledge production is shaped not only by what is found, but by what tools and paradigms are deemed valid. At the heart of this inquiry is a contradiction. Modern science has proven that the Sahara was once habitable and inhabited, but historical narratives have failed to fully incorporate this data into a redefinition of civilizational development. What emerges is a ghost continent, a once thriving region made silent not just by climate, but by selective memory. And if memory is selective, the question must be asked, what is at stake in this forgetting? This investigation does not aim to prove the existence of a singular Saharan civilization, nor to impose a teleological narrative of rise and fall. Instead, it seeks to interrogate the assumptions that have led to the Sahara's exclusion from global history. It will trace the ecological shifts that transformed the region, examine material and symbolic evidence of human presence, explore how various powers, colonial, religious, academic, have structured the epistemology of erasure, and propose alternative frameworks for reconstructing the deep past of the world's largest hot desert. To do this, the analysis must begin with the climate itself. Understanding the African humid period is essential, not just for ecological context, but for setting the parameters of possibility. If the Sahara was once green, then the material conditions for complex society did exist. From there, the investigation will move through stone structures, linguistic traces, genetic remnants, and historical accounts, each a fragment pointing to a past far richer than currently acknowledged. Only by assembling these fragments with forensic precision can a picture emerge of what was lost and why it was never meant to be remembered. This is not merely an archaeological or climatological exercise. It is a philosophical challenge to how knowledge is constructed, legitimized, and transmitted. It questions the very criteria by which we judge historical significance. It interrogates the silence not as absence, but as the outcome of deliberate framing. And it raises a haunting proposition that entire worlds may have existed in the Sahara, built, lived, and forgotten, before the sands came not only to bury them, but to bury the memory of their possibility. The modern image of the Sahara as a lifeless expanse collapses under scrutiny when confronted with climatic data from the early and mid-Holocene. Geological and climatological investigations have documented that the Sahara experienced radical shifts in moisture availability over the last 20,000 years, particularly during what is now termed the African humid period. This epoch, stretching roughly from 11,700 to 5,000 years before present, transformed the Sahara into a fertile landscape of savannas, grasslands, river systems, and vast lakes. Far from being barren, the region supported diverse ecosystems, megafauna, and human populations that engaged in sustained habitation, subsistence, and movement. Paleoclimatic reconstructions based on lake cores, speleothem data, and pollen analysis confirm that the Sahara during this period received significantly more rainfall than today. In some areas more than 300 millimeters annually, sufficient to sustain grasslands and even forest patches. The now extinct Lake Mega Chad, for example, covered an area of over 350,000 square kilometers at its peak, rivaling the surface area of modern-day Germany. Sediment analyses from its basin reveal the presence of aquatic fauna such as crocodiles, fish, and mollusks, pointing to a once vibrant freshwater system. Similarly, Satellite-based radar imaging has revealed the courses of ancient rivers, including the Tamanrasset and Kufra systems, now buried beneath the desert sands. These discoveries dismantle the notion of the Sahara as a static desert. The landscape was dynamic, shaped by orbital cycles, monsoon patterns, and feedback loops between vegetation and albedo. The Holocene monsoon maximum, triggered by increased solar radiation due to Earth's orbital precession, brought moisture-laden winds deep into the interior of North Africa. This influx of moisture supported the development of lakes and wetlands that in turn created microclimates conducive to plant growth and animal life. The feedback effects of vegetation cover on regional humidity created a self-reinforcing cycle that maintained the humid conditions for millennia. Human populations adapted to these conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that small-scale foraging communities began to spread throughout the Sahara during the early Holocene. These groups utilized lake shores and riverbanks for fishing, hunting, and gathering. As the environment stabilized, more complex subsistence strategies emerged. The domestication of cattle is among the earliest indicators of social organization in the region, predating both the Nile Valley and the Levant in some sites. This shift from foraging to pastoralism marks a significant cultural transformation, enabling mobile communities to exploit the vast grasslands of the Green Sahara while maintaining cohesive social structures over large territories. The most telling evidence of sustained human presence is not buried artifacts but rock art. Thousands of engravings and paintings scattered across the central Saharan massifs, especially in regions like Tassili Najr and the Ennedi Plateau, depict scenes of daily life, ritual, and symbolic cosmology. These images, preserved on rock faces, show not only domesticated animals and social gatherings, but also detailed representations of flora and aquatic life, reinforcing the paleo-environmental findings. The art sequences exhibit stylistic progression over centuries, suggesting cultural continuity and adaptation over long periods rather than episodic occupation. Yet, the climatic transition that reversed this greening was equally radical. Around 5,000 years ago, the African humid period began to decline, initially gradually and then with increasing acceleration. The monsoon retreated southward, rainfall decreased, and the landscape underwent desertification. Vegetation collapsed, lakes dried up, and the river systems that had sustained human life disappeared. This transition was not linear nor synchronous. Across the Sahara, different regions experienced aridification at different rates and times. However, the overall trajectory was unambiguous. The land was becoming uninhabitable. The cause of this climatic collapse lies partly in orbital forcing. But recent studies suggest a complex interplay between natural cycles and anthropogenic influences. The expansion of pastoralism and fire use by humans may have contributed to vegetation loss, decreasing local humidity and accelerating desertification. While the extent of human-induced feedback is debated, it is clear that climate and human action operated in tandem to reshape the environment. As the land dried, populations were forced to migrate. Some moved toward the Nile, contributing to the demographic and cultural intensification that preceded the rise of pharaonic Egypt. Others pushed southward into the Sahel and the West African savannas. The disintegration of Saharan habitable zones did not lead to extinction, but to displacement and reconfiguration. The civilizations that arose on the peripheries of the desert may have carried with them fragments, material, linguistic, and cosmological, of their Saharan antecedents. What complicates this reconstruction is the non-uniform nature of the aridification process. Pockets of relative humidity persisted in refugia such as oases, enabling localized continuities of culture. Moreover, the idea of a sharp civilizational collapse assumes a centralized system, which is unlikely in this context. Rather, The Sahara during the Holocene was populated by decentralized, mobile, and semi-sedentary communities adapted to the ecological gradient. Their disappearance from the historical record is not due to the failure of central institutions, but the gradual unviability of their adaptive strategies. This raises a foundational issue for archaeological methodology. When mobility is the norm and durable architecture is rare, what traces can be expected to remain? The absence of ruins does not imply the absence of civilization, only the absence of permanence. This challenge is magnified by the subsequent burial of the landscape under dunes and sand sheets, which obscures both natural and cultural stratigraphy. Many potential sites remain inaccessible, and those that have been discovered are often interpreted through lenses shaped by sedentary-centric biases. The notion of a green Sahara is not speculative. It is empirically verified, multidisciplinary, and measurable. Yet the historical implications of this environmental transformation remain underdeveloped. The conventional civilizational narrative has not accommodated the idea that an entire phase of human development occurred on what is now deemed a void. Instead, the Sahara is treated as a corridor, a space between civilizations, rather than a space of civilization itself. This misrepresentation stems not from lack of evidence, but from a failure to integrate environmental data into civilizational frameworks. The African humid period provided the ecological substrate for cultural formation. Lakes and rivers enabled aggregation, fishing, and ritual. Grasslands supported pastoralism and long-distance movement. Ecological diversity fostered linguistic, symbolic, and technological differentiation. The disappearance of this environment is not merely a natural event, but a civilizational rupture, a transformation that erased the conditions for habitation and, in doing so, erased memory. To understand what may have existed in the Sahara before the sands, it is necessary to take the climate not as background, but as protagonist. The Green Sahara was not a footnote to history. It was a stage on which a forgotten human drama once unfolded. The absence of ancient Saharan civilizations from modern historical narratives is not solely the result of lost structures or eroded artifacts. It is also a function of cartographic silence, the systematic non-representation of the regions past on maps, both historical and contemporary. Cartography, as a practice, is not a neutral documentation of geography. It is a selective projection of knowledge and power, reflecting the interests, assumptions, and biases of its creators. The Sahara's portrayal in most cartographic traditions, especially those derived from Greco-Roman, Islamic, and later European sources, has consistently framed it as a void, a terra nullius devoid of memory, history, or human development. This framing has had profound epistemological consequences. Ancient Mediterranean maps, while occasionally noting the existence of Libya interior or vague references to tribes like the Garamantes, largely ignored the interior of the Sahara. Ptolemy's Geographia, compiled in the 2nd century CE, attempted a comprehensive description of the known world, yet rendered the vast Saharan interior as a blank or a zone of mythical speculation. Despite trade networks that connected Carthage, Egypt, and sub-Saharan Africa, and despite reports of caravan routes and contact with interior peoples, classical geographers relegated the desert to the periphery of knowability. This was not due to ignorance alone, but to epistemic prioritization. The focus was on coastlines, cities, and ports, not nomadic trails, oases, or inland ritual centers. Islamic geographers of the medieval period inherited many of these conventions. Although scholars like al-Idrisi and Ben Battuta provided more detailed information about Saharan travel routes and trade nodes, such as to Gaza, Walata, and Timbuktu, their maps too often reinforced the desert as a barrier, a transitional space between the Islamicized north and the unknown south. Crucially, even as they described trans-Saharan commerce in salt, gold, and slaves, these geographers rarely speculated on the deep past of the region. Their interest was contemporaneous and practical, locating existing settlements and guiding pilgrims or merchants. The possibility that the Sahara itself had once hosted complex societies was never systematically investigated. The cartographic traditions of early modern Europe built on these frameworks, but added a new layer, the scientific veneer of colonial exploration. European cartographers in the 17th to 19th centuries undertook increasingly precise measurements of African geography, often funded by colonial states or commercial interests. But their representations of the Sahara remained overwhelmingly blank or embellished with speculative features, mythical lakes, mountains of gold, or routes of lost armies. These maps served not to inform, but to assert dominion. The blank spaces justified exploration, conquest, and the extraction of resources. By depicting the Sahara as empty, they made it ideologically available for occupation. It is during this period that the concept of the white man's burden in Africa was spatialized on maps. Entire regions were depicted as uninhabited or underutilized, despite the presence of pastoralist communities, ancient trails, and archaeological ruins. The act of mapping was thus intertwined with the erasure of indigenous presence. In the Sahara, this process was particularly effective because of the desert's already marginal status. With few visible cities or monumental ruins, it was easy for colonial cartographers to present the landscape as devoid of civilizational history. Where ruins were encountered, such as the Garamantian hydraulic systems or tumuli, they were often misattributed or dismissed as recent anomalies. The effect of this cartographic erasure continues today. Modern educational maps, even in African countries, often replicate the colonial template, a vast beige swath labeled Sahara Desert with minimal detail. Contemporary satellite imagery has revealed a dense network of paleocanals, ancient lake basins, and possible anthropogenic structures, yet these are rarely integrated into standard geographical representations. The persistence of the blank desert in educational and reference maps reinforces a deep-seated cognitive framing, the Sahara as an ahistorical space. This silence is compounded by the way archaeological data is visualized. Excavation reports and paleoenvironmental studies often isolate data points, a burial site here, a pottery shard there, without representing the broader cultural landscape. The use of scientific coordinates and abstract typologies, while precise, can obscure the spatial continuity of past human activity. Without integrated cartographic narratives, the evidence remains fragmentary and fails to generate civilizational hypotheses. This is not merely a technical issue. It reflects the disciplinary disconnection between geography, archaeology, and history. Furthermore, digital cartographic platforms today, from Google Maps to GIS databases, replicate these blind spots. A user scanning satellite images of the Central Sahara will find sparse labeling, limited historical overlays, and minimal engagement with non-modern features. This absence is not due to lack of data, but due to curatorial priorities. Even with technological advances that enable multispectral analysis and archaeological remote sensing, the representational void persists. In effect, we are using 21st century tools to perpetuate 19th century silences. The consequences of these cartographic choices are far-reaching. In academic discourse, the absence of mapped civilizations in the Sahara reinforces the assumption that none existed. In public consciousness, it cements the notion of the desert as a timeless wasteland. In policymaking and heritage preservation, it deprioritizes funding and research for desert archaeology. And in cultural identity, it denies desert communities a connection to deep historical roots, eroding the continuity of memory. To challenge this legacy requires more than adding dots to maps. It requires a cartographic revolution, one that integrates climatic data, archaeological probability, oral traditions, and symbolic geographies into new spatial narratives. Such maps would not depict the Sahara as blank, but as a palimpsest, a layered space of past ecologies, migrations, rituals, and forgotten networks. This shift would not only revise our understanding of North African history, but also challenge the broader methodologies by which historical presence is spatialized. Sahara's historical invisibility on maps is not a reflection of its emptiness, but a record of epistemological blindness. The tools of representation, from parchment maps to satellite interfaces, have failed to register what the sand still conceals. And until those tools are reconfigured to capture complexity rather than absence, the civilizations that once flourished before the sands will remain, cartographically and cognitively, erased. The defining challenge of Saharan archaeology is not merely the scarcity of data, but the systemic barriers to its visibility, interpretation, and integration into global historical frameworks. Beneath the dunes and gravel plains of the Sahara lies a fragmented yet significant archaeological record that calls into question long-standing assumptions about the region's civilizational void. This record, scattered across thousands of kilometers, and various microclimates, includes settlement remains, funerary structures, tool assemblages, rock engravings, and agricultural evidence. Taken individually, these finds might appear modest, but examined collectively and contextually, they reveal a pattern of organized, sustained, and often technologically innovative human activity in what is conventionally considered an ahistorical zone. The earliest archaeological traces in the Central Sahara emerged during the Epipaleolithic and early Holocene periods. Coinciding with the onset of the African humid phase, stone tools found in the Hagar, Tibesti, and Tassili regions display technological continuity with earlier North African industries, but also regional differentiation, suggesting local innovation and adaptation. Microlithic technologies, grinding stones, and ceramic traditions emerge at multiple sites, indicating not only subsistence complexity, but also cultural divergence. These early communities exploited lacustrine and savanna environments, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles and ecological niches. Funerary archaeology offers particularly compelling evidence of structured social organization. Across the Fezzan and Air regions, tumuli fields extend for kilometers, with varied typologies ranging from simple cairns to elaborate keyhole-shaped monuments. Their distribution implies deliberate planning and community coordination. Excavations of these sites have revealed grave goods, orientation patterns, and human remains with indications of complex mortuary practices. At the site of Yuan Mahazig in southwestern Libya, for instance, the mummified remains of a young child were discovered in a stone-lined pit, dating back over 5,000 years, predating the earliest mummies of Egypt. This level of preservation and ceremonial treatment indicates both symbolic thinking and technical competence in body preservation. Equally revealing are the settlements, or traces thereof. The Garamantian sites in the Fezzan, such as the capital at Jerma, display urban features including dense habitation zones, street planning, and defensive structures. Excavations have unearthed residential compounds, ceramic workshops, and storage facilities. The presence of imported goods from the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa demonstrates that these sites were not isolated, but functioned as nodes in transcontinental trade networks. More significantly, the Garamantes engineered an extensive subterranean irrigation system known as Fogaras, underground channels, designed to tap fossil aquifers and deliver water across arid terrain. This technology required advanced hydrogeological knowledge, labor coordination, and maintenance protocols, all indicative of centralized planning capacity. Other less monumental but equally significant finds include rock shelters with cultural deposits, hearths, and faunal remains. At sites like Takarkori, the Barrow, and Adrarbaus, Stratified deposits preserve sequences of occupation stretching over millennia. These layers reveal transitions from foraging to pastoralism, changes in ceramic styles, and shifts in diet corresponding to ecological change. At Gabbero, in particular, the presence of distinct burial populations separated by time and stratigraphy points to demographic turnover, potentially linked to climatic fluctuation or social transformation. These sequences challenge the narrative of Saharan prehistory as static or marginal. Instead, they suggest cyclical processes of settlement, abandonment, and recolonization. Despite this evidence, Saharan archaeology remains underfunded, underreported, and frequently misinterpreted. One reason is logistical: the sheer remoteness and scale of the desert hinder sustained fieldwork. Political instability in countries like Libya, Mali, and Chad further constrains access. But the deeper issue lies in the historiographical frameworks that undervalue non-urban, non-literate societies. The absence of written records in Saharan antiquity has led many scholars to treat the material culture as ethnographic rather than historical, objects of anthropological curiosity rather than components of a civilizational narrative. Moreover, much of the available evidence has suffered from poor preservation or inadequate documentation. Early 20th century expeditions often prioritize spectacular artifacts over systematic survey. Artifacts were removed from their contexts, stored in European institutions, and classified without comprehensive analysis. As a result, even when material exists, it is often divorced from the environmental and social matrices necessary for interpretation. Modern efforts to revisit these collections are hampered by lost provenance data, ambiguous typologies, and outdated theoretical models. Remote sensing has introduced a new dimension to Saharan archaeology. High-resolution satellite imagery has identified potential archaeological features invisible at ground level, such as buried walls, settlement grids, and paleocanal alignments. In the Merzuk and Tadrak regions, infrared imaging has revealed patterns consistent with anthropogenic modification. However, without field validation, these findings remain hypothetical. The integration of remote data with ground truthing is essential, but requires institutional support that has been largely absent. One illustrative example of missed potential lies in the southern Algerian site of Tinhinan, traditionally associated with the legendary ancestor of the Tuareg. The tomb, discovered in the 1920s, yielded gold, silver, and Roman artifacts, indicating elite status and trans-Mediterranean connections. Yet, the interpretation of the site has remained trapped between legend and archaeology, with insufficient follow-up work to clarify its historical role. This pattern of sensational discovery, followed by neglect, characterizes much of Saharan archaeology. The problem is compounded by the disciplinary isolation between climatology, archaeology, and history. Climatic data confirms the habitability of the Sahara in the Holocene. Archaeological data points to sustained occupation and complexity. Yet historians, trained primarily in textual analysis, have struggled to integrate these datasets into coherent narratives. The lack of synthesis has allowed the myth of Saharan emptiness to persist in mainstream historiography. To reverse this trend requires more than fieldwork. It demands a reorientation of scholarly priorities, the development of interdisciplinary methodologies, and the construction of new theoretical models that can accommodate mobility, non-monumentality, and ecological precarity as legitimate civilizational strategies. In other words, it requires that the history of the Sahara be rewritten not as an appendix to Nile or Mediterranean civilizations, but as a dynamic and autonomous chapter in the human past. The archaeology beneath the dunes does not provide easy answers. It offers instead a complex, incomplete, and often ambiguous record. But that is the nature of history at the margins, not silent, but silenced. The Sahara has spoken, in bones, stones, and scars across the landscape. What remains is the task of listening, not for a singular narrative, but for the multiplicity of lives, systems, and adaptations that once animated this now forgotten land. The conventional assumption that monumental architecture is limited to river valleys or temperate zones overlooks the silent, weathered testaments scattered across the Saharan interior. Long before the rise of the Egyptian pyramids or the Mesopotamian ziggurats, and possibly contemporaneously with the earliest Neolithic structures in Europe, communities in the central and western Sahara erected stone monuments whose scale and intentionality suggest a depth of social coordination and symbolic expression that cannot be dismissed as rudimentary. These megalithic and monolithic structures, often neglected in the dominant canon of world archaeology, provide critical insight into the architectural imagination and cosmological systems of pre-desertification Saharan societies. Among the most notable regions for such structures is the area spanning modern-day Niger, Mali, Algeria, and southern Libya, where alignments of standing stones, stone circles, tumuli fields, and platforms dot the landscape. Sites like the Ar Mountains in Niger, Adrar des Ifagaz in Mali, and Tassili Najr in Algeria contain examples of prehistoric lithic constructions that exhibit recurring geometric patterns, alignments, and site hierarchies. These structures often sit in elevated areas, overlooking paleo river systems or former lakes, suggesting deliberate placement in relation to ecological and perhaps ritual landscapes dot in the region of Tichit Walata in Mauritania. For example, an extensive network of stone-walled enclosures and tumuli dating back to at least 2000 BCE represents one of the most significant concentrations of early Saharan megalithism. The architecture comprises dry stone compounds, granary structures, and ceremonial enclosures, revealing complex spatial planning and probable economic stratification. While not conventionally megalithic in the European sense, the technical proficiency and societal organization implied by their construction challenges the prevailing assumption that prehistoric West Africa lacked architectural development. Farther east, in the Mesic and Tadrat regions of Libya, isolated and grouped monoliths rise from the rocky plateaus, sometimes aligned in linear or circular formations. The size of these stones, some weighing multiple tons, necessitates coordinated labor, suggesting either communal effort or a form of proto-specialization. Though these structures lack inscriptions, their spatial arrangement hints at calendrical or astronomical purposes, a hypothesis supported by ethnographic analogues and comparative archaeoastronomy. The consistent orientation of certain stone lines towards solar or stellar points, solstices, equinoxes, or specific star risings implies a functional cosmology embedded in the landscape. The functional ambiguity of these structures poses a significant interpretive challenge. Without written records or organic remains suitable for dating, scholars often default to conservative estimates or dismiss their significance entirely. Yet their very presence contradicts narratives of nomadism as ephemeral or cultureless. These stones, intentionally selected, transported, and erected, are durable declarations of memory, boundary, and identity. They encode intentionality in physical form, regardless of the interpretative vacuum left by later historical ruptures. Critically, the broader academic reluctance to categorize Saharan lithic architecture as civilizational reflects deeper disciplinary biases. Monumentality in mainstream archaeology is often equated with state formation, surplus labor, and centralized authority, features inferred from contexts like the Nile or the Tigris-Euphrates. When faced with the absence of clear urbanization or script in Saharan contexts, scholars hesitate to apply the same labels. Yet this hesitation reveals more about the limitations of the framework than about the nature of the evidence. Monumentality can emerge in non-state contexts and coordinated construction can occur in acephalous societies. The stones of the Sahara challenge the assumption that complexity must follow a specific trajectory. Furthermore, comparisons with megalithic traditions in Europe, such as Stonehenge or the Karnak alignments, are rarely pursued, despite architectural parallels. The chronological overlap of some Saharan sites with early Neolithic Europe opens the possibility of convergent development or, more controversially, long-distance conceptual diffusion. While there is no direct evidence of contact between Saharan and European megalith builders, the comparative disregard with which Saharan monuments are treated underscores a geopolitical asymmetry in archaeological prestige. Western Europe's stones have been mythologized and preserved. The Saharas are neglected, threatened by erosion, looting, and indifference. Another overlooked dimension is the integration of stoneworks into ritual and funerary practices. Many tumuli sites exhibit spatial relationships with standing stones or engraved surfaces, forming complex ritual topographies. The juxtaposition of burial sites with alignment structures suggests layered functions: astronomical, ceremonial, and memorial. These combinations imply not only an awareness of cosmological cycles, but also an intergenerational sense of space, territory, and ancestry. In many cases, the stones may have served as focal points for seasonal gatherings, territorial markers, or pilgrimage routes, though such interpretations remain speculative without corroborating ethnographic data, even in areas now considered devoid of human habitation. Aerial surveys and satellite imagery continue to reveal rectilinear anomalies, circular depressions, and stone arrangements inconsistent with natural geomorphology. In southwestern Libya and northern Chad, for instance, recent imaging has identified hundreds of stone boats, crescent-shaped stone arrangements whose function is unknown, but whose regularity and distribution suggest a shared cultural logic. Their visibility only from above raises further questions about intentionality and perception. Were they meant to be seen from elevated hills, or do they reflect symbolic cosmographies unrelated to immediate visual apprehension? The destruction of these structures through natural and anthropogenic processes adds urgency to the investigation. Wind erosion, thermal cracking, and human interference, including treasure hunting and military activity, have damaged or obliterated numerous sites. The lack of national heritage protections in many Saharan countries, coupled with the remoteness of the terrain, renders these sites vulnerable. Without systematic documentation and preservation efforts, the stones may vanish before their meanings are even hypothesized, much less understood. Despite these obstacles, the megaliths and monoliths of the Sahara remain silent witnesses to an alternate historical trajectory, one not anchored in urban density or script, but in symbolic permanence and spatial consciousness. They demand a revision of archaeological metrics, a recalibration of what counts as monumental, what qualifies as complex, and what deserves preservation. Their marginalization in the historical record is not the result of inherent ambiguity, but of disciplinary neglect. These stoneworks are not outliers to civilization. They are alternate expressions of it. In recognizing their significance, the Sahara must be reimagined not as a space between civilizations, but as a place where civilization took on unfamiliar, yet no less profound forms. The megalithic heritage of the desert is not an anomaly to be explained away, but a cornerstone for rethinking the architectural and ritual capacities of early African societies. What has been considered peripheral may yet prove foundational. If the stones are allowed to speak, the Sahara has long been framed as a barrier, a natural wall separating North Africa from the sub-Saharan interior. This assumption has shaped scholarly and popular narratives alike, portraying the desert as an isolating void rather than a connective space. Yet archaeological, geographical, and historical evidence suggests the opposite. Prior to, and even during, Early phases of desertification. The Sahara was traversed by extensive networks of movement, routes that linked disparate ecological zones, facilitated the exchange of materials and ideas, and supported a form of interregional connectivity, inconsistent with the notion of civilizational isolation. These forgotten roots, buried beneath sands and colonial epistemologies alike, are central to understanding the pre-desertification cultural landscape of North Africa. Ancient pathways crisscross the Sahara, adapting to seasonal availability of water, landscape topography, and shifting socio-political realities. These were not standardized highways, but fluid corridors anchored by oases, lakes, and geological features such as wadis and escarpments. The modern understanding of trade. Routes often projects modern economic rationality onto these paths, reducing them to lines of commodity exchange. However, the movement across the Green Sahara also enabled seasonal migration, ritual pilgrimage, knowledge transmission, and intergroup alliances. The continuity of these functions across millennia challenges the binary of sedentary versus nomadic, suggesting instead a spectrum of mobility, integrated into cultural systems. Archaeological data from various regions underscore this connectivity. In the central Sahara, shell ornaments of Red Sea origin have been found far inland, indicating transcontinental exchange even before the emergence of formalized trade. Obsidian tools traced through geochemical analysis reveal movement of raw materials over hundreds of kilometers, suggesting sustained interaction among communities spread across otherwise disparate regions. At sites such as Adrar Baus, Takarkori, and Gabero, non-local materials, including ceramics with external stylistic features, point to contact zones rather than cultural isolation. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence is the Garamantian network in the Fezzan, which functioned as a nexus linking the Mediterranean coast with the Sahel. The Garamantas operated over 1,000 years and maintained caravan routes to sub-Saharan centers such as the Niger River Basin and Lake Chad. Roman sources described their mobility and access to resources that eluded imperial control. Recent excavations have uncovered stabling facilities, road traces, and water management systems that imply organized long-distance operations. These systems were not spontaneous adaptations, but institutionalized infrastructures of movement, embedded within broader economic and social matrices. Beyond the Garamantes, older pre-literate pathways may have facilitated early Holocene interactions between Nile Valley communities and interior populations. The discovery of Saharan rock art, depicting cattle in boats in regions distant from major water bodies, suggests symbolic or ritual linkages with aquatic iconography, potentially influenced by Nilotic traditions. Conversely, early Egyptian motifs may have incorporated symbols derived from westward interactions, blurring the origin of key religious and mythological constructs. The cultural gradient between Nile and Sahara was not one-directional. It was dialogical, shaped by mutual influence rather than hierarchical diffusion. Climatic shifts also played a critical role in defining the temporality and functionality of these routes. During humid phases, lakes such as Maga Chad, Lake Fezzan, and others served as hubs around which movement clustered. As these bodies receded, pathways realigned, creating new corridors or rendering others obsolete. The adaptability of Saharan mobility networks to ecological constraints reflects a form of environmental intelligence often underestimated by modern observers. Routes were never fixed. They were contingent, negotiated continuously by communities. With deep knowledge of terrain and seasonal rhythms, the decline of these routes did not occur uniformly. Some persisted well into historical periods, adapted by Berber, Arab, and Tuareg groups into trans-Saharan trade circuits. However, the memory of earlier networks, predating Islamic expansion and trans-Saharan commerce, has largely vanished from written records. Oral traditions in various Tuareg and Songhai communities occasionally reference ancestral migrations across now barren territories, but these accounts are often dismissed as myth rather than examined for historical substrata. The marginalization of oral memory as a valid source of historical data contributes to the erasure of early Saharan connectivity. Colonial mappings further entrenched the desert as barrier paradigm. French and British cartographers during the 19th and 20th centuries prioritized routes of commercial or military interest, ignoring or suppressing indigenous knowledge of older trails. The imposition of borders and the militarization of the Sahara fractured traditional pathways, obscuring the continuity of movement that had once defined the region. In many cases, the very language of exploration was couched in terms of penetration, implying that the desert had to be conquered before it could be traversed, an erasure of the fact that it had been traversed for millennia. Modern technology is beginning to recover traces of these forgotten paths. Satellite imagery and geospatial analysis have identified linear depressions, worn corridors, and artificial modifications consistent with sustained human movement. In some cases fossilized. Footprints and animal trackways preserved under arid crusts provide micro-evidence of passage across zones now deemed impassable. These technological interventions are revealing a landscape far from empty, one layered with traces of passage, encounter, and exchange. The broader implication of this evidence is profound. The Sahara was not an isolating force, but a dynamic medium of connection. It functioned as a filter and bridge, not a wall. Civilizations on its margins, from Carthage to Noak, from Nubia to the Maghreb, were shaped not only by local ecologies, but by the circulation of materials, ideas, and people through the desert's arteries. This challenges the deep-rooted assumption in historical geography that deserts are passive voids, incapable of producing or transmitting culture. Reframing the Sahara as a connective space necessitates a rethinking of African prehistory and global antiquity more broadly. It dissolves the artificial boundary between North and Sub-Saharan Africa, undermines Eurocentric models of civilizational diffusion, and situates Africa within the heart of ancient global interaction. The forgotten roots across the sands are more than archaeological curiosities. They are the pathways through which early complexity moved, evolved, and transformed. They were never truly forgotten, only ignored. The presence of domesticated cattle in Saharan rock art has long puzzled archaeologists and historians, primarily because these depictions predate similar evidence from regions that are more prominently featured in standard civilizational timelines. Cattle, often shown in herds, accompanied by human figures or incorporated into ritualistic scenes, appear in engraved and painted sequences across a wide swath of the central Sahara. From the plateaus of Tassili Najjar to the valleys of the Ennedi Massif, these images suggest more than subsistence. They imply symbolism, social coordination, and potentially proto-religious structures. Far from being isolated pastoral episodes, these representations point to a coherent cultural complex. The so-called cattle cultures of the Green Sahara, radiocarbon dating of associated organic layers, combined with stratigraphic sequencing, places the emergence of cattle herding in the Sahara as early as 7000 BCE. This predates the earliest signs of full-scale agriculture in the Nile Valley and places Saharan pastoralists among the first human groups to practice deliberate animal domestication in Africa. The shift from foraging to herding represents not only a technological transformation, but a social and ontological one. Domesticated animals introduce a new relationship between humans and the environment, one predicated on control, stewardship, and mobility. The domestication of cattle in the Sahara likely occurred through a process of incremental habituation. Wild bovines, such as Bos primigenius, were gradually integrated into human spheres, initially perhaps through opportunistic enclosures or selective culling. Over time, selection pressures driven by human behavioral preferences rather than strict breeding programs led to morphological and behavioral changes in the animals. The result was not merely an economic asset, but a cultural symbol, deeply embedded in the identity and cosmology of Saharan communities. Cattle feature prominently in Saharan rock art, not only as background fauna, but as central subjects. They are painted with exaggerated horns, often adorned, and sometimes shown in elevated positions relative to human figures. In some panels, human-animal hybrids suggest transformative or shamanic rituals centered on the cow. In others, cattle are depicted in funerary contexts or aligned in procession-like sequences. This symbolic centrality implies that cattle were more than a food source. They were markers of status, ritual currency, and perhaps even spiritual intermediaries. Comparative ethnographic studies in East Africa, particularly among Nilotic pastoralist groups such as the Dinka and Nuer, show similar symbolic economies centered around cattle. These societies use cattle not just for meat and milk, but as measures of social capital, dowry, and divine favor. While it is methodologically dangerous to project contemporary practices backward in time, such parallels suggest that the cognitive and symbolic framework of pastoralism has deep roots. In this light, the rock art of the Green Sahara might be read as a prehistoric expression of values that persisted in modified form long after desertification. The adaptation to pastoralism in the Sahara was closely tied to climatic and ecological conditions. The African humid period provided the vegetation cover and water availability necessary for sustaining large herds. Grasslands, shrublands, and shallow lakes enabled rotational grazing strategies and seasonal movement patterns. Unlike river-based agriculture, which depends on fixed arable plots, Saharan pastoralism was mobile, flexible, and responsive to climatic variation. This mobility, far from being a sign of primitiveness, was a rational and sustainable response to the environmental context. Settlement patterns reflect this mobility. Rather than permanent towns, the archaeological record shows ephemeral structures, post holes, hearths, and surface scatter indicative of seasonal camps. Yet the repeated use of specific locations, coupled with material remains like ceramics, grinding stones, and bone assemblages, points to a stable cultural logic. These were not aimless wanderers, but communities with territorial knowledge, resource management systems, and social cohesion. Genetic studies of domesticated African cattle add another layer of complexity. Analyses of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers reveal that African cattle lineages are distinct from those of the Near East and South Asia, though with evidence of limited admixture. This suggests that domestication occurred independently in Africa, at least in part, rather than as a diffusion from the Fertile Crescent. The Sahara, with its early domesticated cattle and evidence of herd management, is a likely locus for this independent trajectory. Yet it remains underrepresented. In global narratives of Neolithic innovation, this underrepresentation is not accidental. Civilizational models predicated on monumental architecture and written records have little room for mobile herders and symbolic economies. Pastoralists challenge the settled, agriculturalist bias of mainstream historiography. Their remains are harder to detect, their legacies more diffuse, and their stories less linear. As a result, entire cultural systems like the cattle cultures of the Green Sahara are rendered marginal or omitted altogether. The transition out of pastoral dominance in the Sahara occurred gradually, as aridity increased and the ecological zones supporting large herds contracted. Some groups moved toward the Sahel, adapting their practices to new environments. Others may have integrated into emerging agrarian systems in the Nile Valley or Maghreb. Yet the symbolic legacy of the cattle persisted. Religious motifs, totemic animals, and cosmological structures in subsequent North and West African societies bear echoes of this pastoralist past. Importantly, The disappearance of the cattle cultures from the archaeological and historical mainstream is not simply a consequence of environmental change. It is also the result of epistemic filtering, what gets excavated, published, and interpreted. Sites associated with nomadic or semi-nomadic groups often receive less attention, funding, and preservation priority. When material is found, it is frequently contextualized as peripheral to real civilizations rather than treated as integral to early African complexity. To reintegrate the cattle cultures into the broader narrative of human development requires a methodological shift. Archaeologists and historians must account for alternative forms of complexity, those not predicated on cities, literacy, or metallurgy. Societies that mobilize knowledge of ecology, animal behavior, and social reproduction through mobile frameworks were no less sophisticated than their sedentary counterparts. Their material traces may be faint, but their cultural footprints are deep. The cattle herders of the Green Sahara did not build pyramids or empires, but they developed sustainable lifeways, symbolic systems, and regional networks that persisted for millennia. Their disappearance from the physical landscape is the result of environmental transformation. Their disappearance from the historical record, however, is the result of selective remembering. The cattle etched on Saharan rocks still watch in silence, awaiting recognition not as curiosities, but as cultural ancestors. The development of writing is commonly considered a hallmark of civilization. It is often treated as the threshold between prehistory and history, a boundary that, once crossed, signifies the capacity to generate, preserve, and transmit abstract knowledge across generations. In the dominant civilizational schema, this transition is associated with Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China. Sub-Saharan Africa, lacking widespread ancient writing systems, are thus often excluded from this developmental arc. However, the assumption that the Sahara had no script or symbolic system before Islam is misleading. Evidence, although fragmentary and often misclassified, suggests that proto-writing or symbol systems were present among early Saharan populations and that they fulfilled communicative, ritual, and cognitive functions beyond mere decoration. Rock engravings and paintings across the central and western Sahara provide the first level of evidence. Beyond their depictions of animals and pastoral life, many panels contain abstract signs, dots arranged in grids, spirals, cross-hatching, zigzag lines, and other geometric patterns. These are not random or purely aesthetic. Their recurrence, variation, and contextual placement within rock art sequences indicate a structured, intentional system. In some instances, such signs are found near entrances to rock shelters or on the surfaces of ceremonial stones, suggesting an associative function, possibly related to territory, identity, ritual access, or calendrical markings. While no single corpus of Saharan symbols has been deciphered as a coherent writing system, the repeated use of abstract motifs suggests the presence of a visual semiotic code. These may have functioned similarly to ideograms or mnemonic aids, rather than phonetic representations. This aligns with early stages of script development seen in other parts of the world, where symbols gradually moved from pictographic representation to phonetic abstraction. In this light, the symbolic repertoire of the Saharan rock art cannot be dismissed as purely decorative or representational. It occupies a transitional space between image and script. One of the most debated pieces of evidence is the Tifana script, a set of characters used by Tuareg communities and Berber speakers across North Africa. Tifana is today used for inscriptions and identity markers, particularly in cultural and political expressions of a Maasai identity. While modern Tifana is primarily phonetic, its origins are obscure. The classical form, sometimes referred to as Libico-Berber, appears in epigraphic inscriptions dating back to the first millennium BCE. However, some scholars argue for a much older origin, linking certain characters to rock engravings. Found in Saharan contexts dating back to the Neolithic, the resemblance between some typhonic characters and abstract signs in Saharan rock art is suggestive, though not conclusive. A direct line of descent is difficult to establish, given the absence of continuous inscriptions or associated phonetic keys. Yet the visual similarity, geographic continuity, and functional parallel support the hypothesis that symbolic traditions in the Sahara may have influenced or prefigured later writing systems in North Africa. This continuity would place Saharan populations not as illiterate voids, but as participants in the longue durée of symbolic evolution. Additional evidence: commies from engraved stones found in burial contexts. In the Fezzan region, for example, several tumuli excavations have revealed stones marked with incised symbols, placed deliberately near human remains. These are not utilitarian objects, nor do they appear to serve as simple markers. Their placement suggests a communicative or protective function, perhaps inscriptions of names, lineages, or ritual invocations. The inability to decipher these symbols should not be mistaken for a lack of meaning. It reflects only the absence of a bilingual key or contextual frame. That such symbols were used in funerary settings further implies a belief in the communicative power of signs beyond the material world. Moreover, the argument that true writing must conform to phonetic standards reflects a narrow, script-centric model derived from alphabetic traditions. Many early civilizations used logographic, ideographic, or hybrid systems that encoded complex information without representing spoken language directly. In this sense, the Saharan symbolic systems, whether painted, engraved, or carved, might be better understood as a third category, neither art nor writing in the conventional sense, but a medium of encoding information suited to the cultural and cognitive needs of their creators. Comparisons with other early script traditions reinforce this view. In the Vinca culture of Neolithic southeastern Europe, for example, ceramic symbols known as the Vinca signs remain undeciphered, but are considered potential proto-writing. Similarly, the Jiahu symbols of early China and the Despelio tablet of Greece are seen as precursors to full script systems. These examples are widely acknowledged in academic literature, despite the lack of decipherment. The Saharan symbols deserve equal consideration, not as anomalies but as early efforts in symbolic abstraction. The loss or discontinuity of such systems is not unique to the Sahara. Writing and symbol systems often emerge, fade, or transform in response to ecological, social, or political pressures. The shift from mobile pastoralism to displaced communities, the onset of desertification, and the later spread of foreign scripts, such as Arabic, likely contributed to the erosion of Saharan semiotic traditions. What is lost, however, is not only the physical script, but the epistemic paradigm it supported. These symbols encoded knowledge systems, cosmologies, and social contracts that are no longer legible to modern observers. Colonial and post-colonial scholarship has compounded this loss by dismissing such artifacts as primitive or ornamental. The Eurocentric assumption that writing must be alphabetic, permanent, and centralized has rendered ephemeral, distributed, or ritual-based systems invisible. Museums house engraved stones and symbolic artifacts from the Sahara, but often catalog them without interpretive frameworks. They are disconnected from the landscapes, oral traditions, and cognitive models that gave them meaning. This decontextualization ensures that the symbols remain mute, trapped in display cases rather than reintegrated into historical narratives. The recovery of Saharan symbol systems is not merely an archaeological challenge, it is a philosophical one. It requires a redefinition of what constitutes writing, a willingness to accept alternative epistemologies, and a commitment to interdisciplinarity. Linguists, semioticians, anthropologists, and digital analysts must collaborate to reconstruct the lost grammars of the desert. Even if full decipherment proves impossible, pattern recognition, spatial analysis, and comparative semiotics can yield insights into the logic of these signs. If Saharan communities were engaged in symbolic inscription, be it for ritual, memory, property, or cosmology, then they participated in a form of abstraction that predates the textual canon. Their absence from the narrative of script evolution is not the result of absence, but of exclusion. The signs remain, etched into stone, preserved by aridity, waiting not for discovery, but for recognition. The transformation of the Sahara from a green, habitable terrain into an expanse of sand and desolation was not merely an ecological event, it was a civilizational rupture. The process of desertification, beginning roughly 5,000 years ago and accelerating in pulses over the subsequent millennia, resulted in the systematic displacement of human populations, the collapse of settlement networks, and the erosion of social memory. What remains today is not just an arid landscape, but an archive of absence, a space where once there was life, complexity, and culture. Understanding this transformation requires disentangling its environmental dynamics from its epistemological consequences. Paleoclimatic studies confirm that the African humid period came to a gradual but definitive end. Monsoon systems shifted southward, driven by orbital changes in the Earth's precession. Rainfall declined sharply. Lakes like Megachad, which once covered vast areas, began to shrink. Rivers dried, vegetation receded, and regions that had supported cattle herding and intermittent cultivation became inhospitable. This desiccation did not occur uniformly across the Sahara. Instead, it manifested in regional sequences, creating temporary refugia where populations could adapt for a time, before being forced to migrate or disband. The ecological collapse imposed structural constraints on human systems. Pastoral economies, based on grazing, were undermined as forage disappeared. Settlements, once strategically positioned near lakes or rivers, lost their viability. Underground water systems like fogaras could not compensate indefinitely for diminishing aquifer recharge. Populations faced a series of non-linear thresholds, not a single moment of collapse, but a cascading sequence of failures in environmental support systems, leading to abandonment, reorientation, or extinction of communities. Crucially, this environmental transformation coincided with the disappearance of symbolic, architectural, and social markers. The cessation of rock art production in many Saharan zones aligns with the onset of increasing aridity. Tumuli fields and megalithic sites show declining construction activity, suggesting not only demographic contraction, but perhaps also a loss of ritual capacity. The absence of transitional layers, artifactual sequences linking vibrant cultural production with arid abandonment, implies that many sites were rapidly vacated. What was not physically destroyed by desertification was slowly consumed by wind erosion, sand encroachment, and climatic extremes, while environmental change is the proximate cause of this civilizational silence. It does not fully account for the epistemological erasure that followed. Other regions have suffered ecological collapse without being written out of history. The Maya lowlands, the Akkadian Empire, or the Harappan civilization all experienced environmental stress, yet their remnants remain present in global consciousness. In the Sahara's case, the physical absence became a justification for narrative absence. The desert, empty of visible cities or enduring inscriptions, was deemed to have always been empty, a classic example of retroactive nullification. This narrative was reinforced by the methodological limitations of historical and archaeological disciplines. Traditional archaeology relies on the recovery of durable artifacts, stone, metal, ceramics, and texts. In Saharan contexts, organic materials disintegrated, and mobile lifeways left few permanent imprints. Nomadic structures, leather goods, wooden implements, and oral traditions vanished under the twin pressures of climate and time. Without ruins in the classical sense, Saharan cultures were excluded from the category of civilization. The absence of monumental decay was read as the absence of monumentality itself. The effect of this erasure was twofold. First, it produced a chronological gap. Thousands of years of human activity were relegated to prehistory or ignored entirely. Second, it reinforced a spatial binary. North Africa was aligned with Mediterranean history, Sub-Saharan Africa with later oral traditions, and the Sahara was left as an inert middle, a geographical corridor, rather than a civilizational contributor. This spatial amnesia had implications for the construction of African history, which became bifurcated between civilized North and tribal Sub-Sahara, with the desert as an ideological and historiographical void. This process of forgetting was not passive. It was embedded in institutional practices, museum curation that decontextualized Saharan artifacts, academic frameworks that privileged text over symbol, and educational curricula that omitted Saharan timelines from African or world history. Narratives. The desert's silence was not intrinsic. It was manufactured through selective emphasis, disciplinary biases, and political disinterest. One might argue that desertification made long-term cultural memory unsustainable. However, this assertion underestimates the adaptive capacities of human societies. Mobile pastoralists, for instance, have historically maintained oral traditions, kinship structures, and ritual systems across vast and changing landscapes. The Tuareg, Fulani, and Taboo peoples preserve linguistic and cosmological traces that may echo pre-desertification cultures. Yet without archaeological corroboration, these continuities are rarely treated as legitimate historical data. The threshold for evidence in Saharan studies remains prohibitively high, reinforcing the silence even where signals persist. The collapse into silence also intersects with power. As the Sahara hardened into desert, and as later empires and states emerged on its fringes, the memory of the interior became less valuable, less usable. Neither Egyptian nor Islamic historiography found strategic reasons to recover or preserve Saharan antiquity. Later, European colonial regimes had every incentive to depict the Sahara as void to justify conquest, to project narratives of civilizational rescue, and to ignore indigenous claims. Silence, in this context, served as both a mask and a weapon. What remains today is a palimpsest of partial traces, eroded petroglyphs, displaced artifacts, buried hydrological systems, and faintly remembered stories. These traces challenge the myth of civilizational vacuum. They point to a period in which the Sahara was not only habitable, but inhabited by culturally complex societies with their own symbolic universes, economic systems, and environmental management strategies. Their collapse was not merely ecological, it was discursive. To understand desertification as erasure is to recognize that environmental transformation has historical, epistemic, and ideological consequences. The sands did not simply cover the past. They enabled a narrative in which the past could be denied. Reconstructing Saharan history thus requires more than recovering artifacts. It requires exposing the mechanisms that made forgetting possible, permissible, and politically expedient. In the end, the desert's silence is not a natural state. It is a condition produced by events, structures, and decisions, geological, cultural, and institutional. The collapse of the Saharan civilizations was not just an ending. It was a disappearance engineered not only by wind and sun, but by the frameworks through which we define, record, and remember the human story. The early development of dynastic Egypt is often celebrated as one of the pinnacles of ancient civilization. With its monumental architecture, codified religion, and extensive written records, Egypt has long held a central place in the historical imagination. However, Egypt did not emerge in a vacuum. Its formation was the product of ecological dynamics, intercultural exchange, and population movement across a broader Northeast African landscape. While scholars have long acknowledged Nubian and Levantan influences, The possibility of significant cultural and demographic input from the West, the Sahara, has remained marginal. This exclusion is not due to lack of evidence, but to the invisibility of Saharan contributions within the epistemological boundaries of Egyptology. The Sahara and the Nile Valley are often treated as separate environmental worlds. Yet during the African humid period, the ecological divide between the two was far less stark. Wadis and seasonal rivers connected the Libyan desert to the Nile Valley. Pleistocene and early Holocene lake systems bridged the topographical gap. Human groups could and did move between them. Archaeological evidence from Nabta Playa and Burkiseba in the western desert of Egypt suggests that well-organized communities were operating in the region before the establishment of dynastic Egypt. These sites, with their stone circles, alignments, and ceremonial structures, point to ritual and calendrical systems that may have influenced or paralleled those of the early Nile civilizations. At Nabta Playa, in particular, archaeologists have uncovered a series of stone arrangements dated to around 6000 BCE, including a megalithic circle with potential solstitial alignments. The presence of cattle burials, symbolic sculptures, and underground water management features indicates a high degree of environmental knowledge and social coordination. Some scholars argue that this site represents an ideological precursor to Egyptian cosmology, a prototype of the ritual landscape that would later manifest in temple complexes and mortuary architecture. If this is correct, then key elements of Egyptian religious thought may have roots not in the Nile floodplain but in the Saharan steppe. Iconographic evidence further complicates the story. Pre-dynastic art from Upper Egypt often depicts figures with elaborate headdresses, animal-human hybrids, and ritual processions that echo motifs found in Saharan rock art. These visual parallels suggest a shared or interacting symbolic vocabulary. Moreover, some early Egyptian gods, such as Set, are associated with the desert and its liminal qualities, both feared and revered. The boundary between order and chaos, central to Egyptian metaphysics, may well have been shaped by memories of the encroaching desert and the cultures that once inhabited it. Linguistic evidence, though fragmentary, also hints at Saharan intersections. Afro-Asiatic language dispersals have been modeled to originate near the Sahara during the early Holocene, with branches moving east toward the Nile and west into the Maghreb and Sahel. This dispersal implies sustained movement and contact among populations. While the Egyptian language occupies a distinct branch within the Afro-Asiatic family, its early formation likely occurred in a context of multilingual interaction, shaped by pastoralist and agro-pastoralist groups who traversed both the Nile and the desert hinterlands. Despite these indicators, the influence of Saharan populations on early Egyptian state formation has been underexplored. Egyptology has long favored textual and monumental sources, temple inscriptions, tomb reliefs, and papyri. Saharan cultures, lacking such materials, are seen as peripheral. When contact is acknowledged, it is often framed in terms of Egypt's expansion westward, military campaigns, trade, or symbolic conquest. The reverse movement from the desert into Egypt is rendered improbable by methodological default, rather than demonstrable absence. This asymmetry is reinforced by ideological factors. Egypt's place in world history has been fiercely contested, especially in debates over its African identity. To acknowledge a Saharan contribution is to reaffirm Egypt's African rootedness culturally, demographically, and symbolically. Yet this recognition threatens entrenched narratives that situate Egypt within a Mediterranean or Near Eastern continuum. By ignoring the West, scholars have preserved a partial image of Egypt, brilliant, yes, but isolated, ahistorical, and disconnected from its African context. Colonial legacies also play a role. Much of modern Egyptology was shaped by European scholars operating under assumptions of racial and civilizational hierarchy. The desert, especially its black African populations, was associated with primitiveness and backwardness. To attribute complexity, symbolic systems, or cosmological influence to such groups was unthinkable within the dominant intellectual climate of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Even today, disciplinary boundaries and museum classifications perpetuate these divisions. Egyptian artifacts are curated as part of classical antiquity or Near Eastern studies, while Saharan artifacts, if included at all, fall under prehistoric Africa or ethnographic collections. Modern archaeological methods offer a chance to rectify this divide. Isotopic analysis of human remains from early dynastic sites in Egypt has revealed diverse dietary profiles and genetic signatures, some of which suggest movement from arid or semi-arid zones. Comparative osteology also shows variation in skeletal morphology, implying multi-ethnic compositions in pre-dynastic cemeteries. These biological signals support the idea that Egypt was not formed by a single ethnocultural lineage, but by a mosaic of interacting groups, including those emerging from the drying Sahara. Oral traditions from Nubia and the Western Desert add a further dimension. Stories of lost ancestors, desert crossings, and sacred lakes echo patterns found in archaeological data. While such traditions are rarely considered admissible in Egyptological discourse, they form part of a broader historical memory that spans the Nile and the Sahara. Their inclusion would challenge the rigid boundaries of what counts as evidence, but would also enrich the narrative of Egyptian origins. To revisit Egypt's hidden Western memory is not to diminish its achievements, but to situate them within a fuller, more accurate historical context. It is to recognize that the Nile Valley was not a closed system, but an attractor drawing in peoples, practices and symbols from surrounding zones, including the now buried landscapes of the Sahara. The desert did not stand outside of Egyptian civilization. It stood behind it, beneath it, and at times within it. In this light, the failure to acknowledge Saharan influence is more than an oversight. It is a structural blind spot. It reflects the limitations of a historiography that privileges permanence over mobility, text over symbol, and eastward horizons over Western legacies. The sands may have buried the memory of the Sahara's contributions, but the traces remain in stone circles, in forgotten paths, in unspoken parallels. Egypt, like all great civilizations, did not invent itself. It emerged from a web of interactions, and among the most obscured of these is the one that came from the West. Among the most significant, but underappreciated civilizations of the ancient Sahara were the Garamantes, a society that flourished in what is now southwestern Libya, particularly in the Fezzan region, between roughly 500 BCE and 700 CE. Their material remains, political structure, and technological innovations reveal a form of desert urbanism rarely acknowledged in broader narratives of antiquity. Despite being described by classical authors and extensively documented through modern archaeology, the Garamantes remain curiously peripheral in discussions of ancient state formation, urban complexity, and trans-Saharan interaction. This exclusion reveals not only a historiographical oversight, but a deeper discomfort with the idea that complex, urbanized societies could arise in what is now considered one of the most inhospitable zones on Earth, the Garamantian heartland centered around the Wadi El Ajel, a broad depression running east to west through the Fezzan. Excavations at sites such as Old Jerma, identified as the probable capital of the Garamantian state, have revealed dense settlement layers, well-defined building foundations, fortified compounds, and evidence of specialized craft production. The city itself appears to have functioned as both an administrative center and a node within broader economic and hydraulic systems. Surrounding Jerma are dozens of satellite sites, including funerary complexes, oasis hamlets, and irrigation hubs, forming a dispersed yet interconnected urban landscape. Perhaps the most striking achievement of the Garamantes was their water management system. In an environment with minimal rainfall and no perennial surface water, they developed an extensive network of subterranean tunnels known as foggaras. These gently sloping conduits, dug into the subsurface to intercept fossil water from aquifers, allowed for gravity-fed irrigation over long distances. Constructing such systems required advanced hydrogeological knowledge, engineering expertise, and coordinated labor. Some foggaras extended for kilometers, linking well fields to palm groves and cultivation plots. The effort to construct and maintain these systems over centuries suggests a level of institutional organization rarely attributed to Saharan societies. While the foggaras themselves have received attention for their technical ingenuity, their broader implications are often overlooked. These systems made sustained urban life possible in a hyper-arid region. They enabled the production of surplus crops, particularly dates, cereals, and vegetables, which in turn supported population density, social stratification, and specialization. Craft production at Jerma included ceramic kilns, metallurgical workshops, and textile activities. Burial practices reveal a hierarchical society, with elite tombs marked by monumental architecture and grave goods imported from as far afield as the Mediterranean. Classical sources, particularly Herodotus and later Pliny the Elder, provide glimpses of the Garamantes through the lens of Greco-Roman perception. They were portrayed variously as exotic nomads, desert raiders, or intermediaries in the trans-Saharan trade. These depictions, often based on second-hand reports, combined fascination with derision, framing the Garamantes as both technologically mysterious and culturally inferior. Yet archaeological evidence contradicts this narrative. The Garamantes were neither purely nomadic nor parasitic on Mediterranean civilizations. They built their own cities, managed their own resources, and developed an indigenous political and social order rooted in Saharan conditions. Modern archaeological projects, particularly those led by researchers from the University of Leicester, in collaboration with Libyan authorities, have radically transformed our understanding of the Garamantes. Through systematic excavation, survey, and remote sensing, these teams have mapped over 100 settlements and documented thousands of tombs, petroglyphs, and irrigation features. Aerial photography has revealed patterns of land use and urban layout consistent with planned settlement. Radiocarbon dating, ceramic typologies, and botanical analysis have established a robust chronological framework, confirming that the Garamantes were active for over a millennium. Despite this wealth of data, the Garamantes remain curiously absent from standard textbooks and syntheses of ancient history. Their urbanism is not framed as a model of early state formation, and their hydraulic engineering is rarely compared with contemporaneous systems in Mesopotamia or the Andes. This exclusion reflects not the marginality of the Garamantes themselves, but the marginalization of Saharan contexts within broader archaeological discourse. Urbanism in the desert disrupts assumptions about environmental determinism, linear development, and the centrality of river-based civilizations. As such, it is easier to ignore than to integrate. Political factors have further complicated the reception of Garamantian history. Libya's unstable political environment, particularly since the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, has curtailed archaeological work and endangered sites. Looting, vandalism, and lack of heritage management have placed many Garamantian remains at risk. At the same time, the ideological utility of the Garamantes has fluctuated. Under Gaddafi, they were occasionally invoked as symbols of African indigeneity and technological prowess, but their portrayal was often inconsistent, shaped more by political expediency than by historical rigor. Post-revolutionary Libya has lacked the institutional continuity to develop a coherent policy for the preservation or interpretation of Garamantian heritage. There is also an epistemic challenge. The Garamantas do not fit neatly into existing civilizational categories. They were not literate in a conventional sense, although they may have used symbols or borrowed scripts from neighboring cultures. They built in mud brick and stone, but left no monumental architecture comparable to Egyptian temples or Roman forums. Their cities were small by modern standards, their art austere, their inscriptions minimal. But to equate this with primitiveness is to impose an anachronistic metric. The Garamantas created a sustainable, locally adapted urbanism that endured for centuries. They solved engineering challenges with minimal resources. They maintained regional networks and absorbed foreign goods without becoming dependent. In many ways, the Garamantas exemplify a desert civilization, a model of complexity rooted in scarcity, mobility, and ecological intelligence. Their achievements call for a reassessment of what constitutes civilization itself. If urban life can flourish in the Sahara, sustained by invisible water and ephemeral architecture, then the boundaries of the ancient world must be redrawn. The Garamantas were not the exception to a rule. They were evidence that the rules are more diverse than previously assumed. To reconstruct Garamantian urbanism is to challenge the deeper logic of historical exclusion. It is to accept that the Sahara was not a blank zone between centers of real history, but a generator of its own forms of complexity. It is to recognize that the failure to remember the Garamantas is not the result of their insignificance, but of the frameworks that define significance in the first place. Long after the ecological collapse of the Green Sahara and the political dissolution of civilizations, like the Garamantas, traces of these ancient populations may still linger not in their ruins, but in the genomes of those who live on the margins of the desert today. Genetic research offers a unique lens through which to study lost civilizations. Unlike artifacts or architecture, which may be destroyed or misattributed, genetic data persists through generations, carrying with it signals of ancestry, migration, and admixture. In the case of the Sahara, population genetics presents an opportunity to reconstruct demographic histories that have been obscured by both natural erasure and historiographical neglect. Studies of modern populations in North Africa, the Sahel, and surrounding regions have revealed a complex genetic mosaic. Analyses using mitochondrial DNA, inherited maternally, Y chromosome haplogroups, inherited paternally, and autosomal DNA, inherited from both parents, all point to repeated episodes of migration, intermixing, and demographic turnover across the Sahara. These patterns suggest that the region was not an impermeable barrier, but a zone of movement and contact, especially during the African humid period, when ecological conditions favored sustained human habitation. One of the most frequently identified maternal haplogroups in North Africa is U6, which shows deep time continuity in the region and may reflect ancient back migrations from Eurasia into Africa. However, other haplogroups, such as L3 and LO, are of sub-Saharan origin, indicating northward movement across what is now desert. On the paternal side, haplogroup EM81 is dominant among Berber populations and appears to have spread from the Maghreb eastward, while haplogroup RV88, associated with the Lake Chad Basin, may trace a corridor of movement from the central Sahara into the Sahel. Perhaps most significantly, genome-wide studies have uncovered a component often labeled as Ancient North African, ANA, which is distinct from both sub-Saharan and Eurasian ancestry. This component appears in ancient skeletal remains from sites such as Tifaralt in Morocco, dated to around 15,000 years ago, and in some modern Berber-speaking populations. Its persistence suggests a long-standing autochthonous presence in the region, likely reflective of early Saharan populations prior to desertification and later demographic reshuffling. This ANA ancestry does not correspond neatly to known historical groups. Instead, it implies a substrate population, possibly the descendants of those who inhabited the Sahara during the Green Sahara epoch. As desertification progressed and populations migrated or were displaced, this genetic legacy may have been diluted or absorbed into surrounding groups. Yet it persists in trace form, like a demographic shadow of civilizations forgotten in the written record but preserved in the body. Further evidence comes from ancient DNA analysis. Although the hyper-arid conditions of the Sahara have made the recovery of such samples rare and technically challenging, nevertheless, some skeletal remains from Saharan contexts, particularly those excavated in better preserved burial sites, have yielded viable DNA sequences. These show a mix of lineages, including connections to both West African and Levantan gene pools, reflecting the Sahara's role as a crossroads rather than a cul-de-sac. One striking case is the Gabbero site in Niger, where two distinct populations were identified in the archaeological layers. The earlier group, known as the Kiphian culture, had robust skeletal morphology and dietary evidence suggesting a reliance on lake resources. The later group, associated with the Tanarian culture, showed different craniofacial features and material. Culture, indicating a demographic replacement or assimilation event. Genetic data, though limited, supports this interpretation. Such turnover may reflect the impact of desertification on population viability and movement, environmental shifts triggering genetic discontinuities. Despite these insights, population genetics in the Sahara faces significant limitations. Modern populations are not static proxies for ancient groups. Admixture, drift, and historical events such as Arab expansion, trans-Saharan trade, and European colonization have profoundly altered gene pools. Interpreting ancient population structure requires careful modeling using both genetic and archaeological parameters. Moreover, political sensitivities and ethical considerations around genetic research in African contexts have constrained sample availability and international collaboration. These challenges are compounded by the conceptual frameworks used in genetic studies. Population labels often rely on modern ethnolinguistic categories: Berber, Arab, Fulani, Tuareg, which may obscure ancient continuities or fabricate spurious boundaries. Additionally, the tendency to frame findings in terms of migration into Africa or diffusion from Eurasia reinforces outdated narratives of external influence and African passivity. In reality, the genetic history of the Sahara reflects reciprocal flows, internal developments, and localized adaptations. The implications of genetic research extend beyond academic debates. For many Saharan and Sahelian communities, questions of origin, belonging, and identity are deeply entangled with colonial histories and contemporary marginalization. Genetic data, when misused, can reinforce essentialist or exclusionary ideologies. But when interpreted critically, it can also recover forgotten connections, linking communities across political borders, across time, and across the silence imposed by sand and historiography. For instance, the Tuareg pastoralist communities whose cultural memory includes myths of ancient cities and lost ancestors show genetic signals from both North African and sub-Saharan lineages, supporting oral histories of movement and mixture. The Fulani, spread across West Africa and long known for their distinctive appearance and pastoralist traditions, also display genetic markers consistent with Saharan ancestry. These findings suggest that the demographic legacy of the Green Sahara persists not in isolated pockets, but in wide swaths of Africa's population. In recognizing these traces, we are forced to reconsider the Sahara not as a void, but as a vanished center, its people dispersed, its memory fragmented, but its imprint still present in the very biology of those who remain. Genetic evidence, when used carefully and integrated with archaeological and linguistic data, can help map the contours of a history that the written record has ignored. The demographic shadows of the Sahara are not ghosts, they are dispersed legacies. They do not speak in inscriptions or monuments, but in alleles and haplotypes. They complicate the narrative of desert emptiness and challenge the assumption that civilization leaves only stone and text in its wake. In the Sahara, civilization may also leave bloodlines, carried forward in silence. The silence surrounding ancient Saharan civilizations is not simply the consequence of natural erosion, environmental collapse, or historiographical accident. It is also the direct result of a long-standing process of ideological suppression structured through colonialism. From the late 19th century onward, European colonial regimes not only dominated the territories of North and West Africa, but also reshaped the way the past of these regions was studied, interpreted, and represented. This entailed a systematic obscuring of Saharan complexity through both the physical practices of excavation and collection, and the intellectual frameworks used to classify, compare, and ultimately dismiss indigenous historical trajectories. The colonial encounter in Africa was premised on a foundational contradiction. In order to justify conquest, the colonizers had to frame the land as underutilized, its peoples as primitive, and its histories as either non-existent or stagnant. This required more than economic violence or administrative control. It required the erasure of historical depth. The Sahara, with its vast expanse and minimal monumental architecture, proved especially susceptible to this logic. It was portrayed as a natural barrier, an empty zone devoid of history, except when occasionally traversed by Arab traders or European explorers. This conception served the dual purpose of negating indigenous claims to the land and affirming the supposed civilizing mission of the colonizers. French colonial administration played a leading role in this reconfiguration, particularly in Algeria, Mali, Niger, and Chad. French scholars, soldiers, and ethnographies systematically collected artifacts, mapped terrain, and categorized peoples all under a hierarchy of value that privileged Greco-Roman ruins, Islamic architecture, and literate cultures. What did not fit within these frameworks: stone circles without inscriptions, tumuli without monumental scale, oral traditions without written records, was relegated to the status of anthropological curiosity or prehistoric footnote. Saharan sites were visited, photographed, even plundered, but rarely integrated into a coherent understanding of African antiquity. Museums in France, especially the Musée de l'Homme and the Musée du Quai Branly, became repositories for this selectively acquired heritage. Artifacts from Saharan burial sites, rock art zones, and oasis settlements were often removed without context, categorized under vague terms like ethnographic object or Neolithic Africa, and displayed without adequate provenance. Their meanings, spatial relationships, and cultural associations were obscured, reduced to fragments in a collection designed to support a narrative of African timelessness and European discovery. British and Italian colonial regimes engaged in similar practices, particularly in Libya, Sudan, and parts of Nigeria. The British in particular emphasized the blankness of the desert as a rationale for cartographic mastery and infrastructural imposition. The Sahara was portrayed not as a site of past innovation, but as an obstacle to be overcome, an inert geography awaiting imperial imprint. The effect of this was not merely physical disruption, but epistemic distortion. Local knowledge systems were dismissed, indigenous historians sidelined, and oral accounts of ancient cities or desert ancestors were deemed mythological rather than historical. This colonial reframing had lasting effects on the academic disciplines that emerged or expanded during the colonial period. Archaeology in Africa was shaped by European priorities and training. Fieldwork often focused on coastal zones, trade emporia, or contact points with classical civilizations. The interior desert, lacking in inscriptions or monumental cities, was deemed a low priority. When research was conducted, it often reinforced Colonial preconceptions that Saharan societies were nomadic, non-hierarchical, and incapable of technological or symbolic complexity. These assumptions permeated the literature. Maps produced during the colonial period consistently labeled the Sahara as uninhabited, desert, or tribal areas, despite the presence of historical settlement ruins, oral traditions of statehood, and material traces of trade. And hydraulic engineering. Textbooks, encyclopedias, and museum guides reproduce these classifications, perpetuating a vision of the Sahara as timeless and peripheral. This vision endured long after formal decolonization, embedded in the disciplines and institutions inherited from the colonial enterprise. Post-independence, African states have struggled to reclaim the secluded heritage. National archaeological services are often underfunded, and political instability in many Saharan countries, Libya, Mali, Chad, has rendered systematic research difficult. Furthermore, post-colonial elites frequently adopt the very historical frameworks imposed by the colonizers, promoting national narratives that focus on Islamic heritage, colonial resistance, or modern development, while neglecting deeper pre-Islamic or prehistoric pasts. In some cases, this neglect is pragmatic archaeological work, does not generate immediate economic or political capital. In others, it reflects the internalization of colonial hierarchies of value. Efforts to reverse this erasure remain fragmentary. Some scholars have begun to re-examine colonial archives, seeking overlooked records of Saharan exploration and excavation. Others are working to digitize oral histories, recontextualize museum collections, and apply new technologies like satellite imagery and LiDAR to detect buried features in the desert. However, these efforts are often siloed, underfunded, and disconnected from public discourse. The broader historical narrative remains unchanged. The Sahara is still largely absent from world history, despite overwhelming evidence of past complexity. Colonial obscuring of Saharan history was not accidental. It was part of a deliberate project to frame Africa as a space without civilizational depth, to legitimize foreign control, and to assert European superiority. This project was executed through fieldwork, academic publication, museum display, and administrative cartography. Its effects persist not only in how we view the Sahara, but in how we define civilization itself through monuments, texts, and permanence rather than mobility, adaptation, and symbolic abstraction. Reclaiming Saharan history requires dismantling these inherited structures. It demands a new historiography that centers African experiences, recognizes alternative forms of complexity, and challenges the epistemological hierarchies embedded in the colonial legacy. It also requires political will on the part of both African states and global institutions to invest in historical reconstruction as a form of cultural sovereignty and intellectual justice. Until then, the Sahara will remain a victim of the colonial gaze, vast, empty, and mute, not because it was always so, but because it was made to appear that way. The expansion of Islam into North and West Africa during the 7th to 14th centuries CE represented a major cultural, religious, and political transformation. In historical scholarship, this process is often framed as a unifying moment, a force that connected disparate societies through a shared faith, language, and legal system. While this integration produced undeniable advancements in literacy, administration, and trans-regional commerce, it also contributed to the systematic marginalization of non-Islamic and pre-Islamic histories. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Sahara, where Islamization reshaped not only religious identity but also historical memory, contributing to an intellectual flattening that erased or subordinated earlier cultural forms. Islam arrived in North Africa through a combination of conquest, trade, and conversion. The Arab-Muslim armies that swept across the Maghreb in the 7th century encountered Berber-speaking populations, some of whom resisted militarily while others adopted the new religion through negotiated arrangements. Over subsequent centuries, Islam became firmly rooted, first in the northern zones and later, through trade and missionary activity in the Sahel and deeper into West Africa. Cities such as Karawang, Sijil Massa, and later Timbuktu emerged as centers of Islamic learning, commerce, and jurisprudence. This process of Islamization brought with it the Arabic language, the script of the Quran, and a corpus of religious and legal texts that emphasize divine revelation and historical linearity. As Islamic institutions became dominant, pre-Islamic oral traditions, ritual practices, and local cosmologies were increasingly suppressed or reinterpreted within an Islamic framework. The Sahara, once home to diverse symbolic systems, rock art, megalithic cultures, and pastoral cosmologies, was redefined as part of Dar al-Islam, a land of submission to God, its past refracted through the lens of Islamic teleology. The adoption of Arabic script and Islamic historiography played a pivotal role in shaping collective memory. Islamic scholars and chroniclers, many of whom were themselves African, began to write histories that emphasized the Islamic credentials of rulers and polities, often beginning narratives with the arrival of Islam. Dynasties were legitimized based on their adherence to Islamic law, and pre-Islamic figures were reimagined as either precursors to or deviants from the true faith. This textualization of history, while invaluable in preserving much of Africa's medieval past, also created a rupture. What could not be expressed in Arabic script or fit within the theological worldview of Islam was excluded from the official record. The case of Timbuktu exemplifies this duality. Celebrated today for its medieval manuscripts and scholarly institutions, the city was a beacon of Islamic erudition in the desert. Yet its fame obscures the older layers of settlement, oral culture, and indigenous belief systems that predated the Islamic era. Many of the scholars of Timbuktu, while African, were constrained by the intellectual frameworks of Islamic theology and jurisprudence. Their works rarely referenced pre-Islamic histories, and when they did, it was often to condemn them as Jahiliyyah, an age of ignorance. This epistemic narrowing was not solely imposed from outside. It was embraced and internalized by many African elites, who saw in Islam a path to legitimacy, literacy, and integration into broader trade and diplomatic networks. The Islamic identity of Saharan and Sahelian polities became central to their self-definition, often at the expense of older traditions. Conversion became both a religious act and a political strategy, enabling access to trans-Saharan commerce, Islamic jurisprudence, and diplomatic recognition by other Muslim rulers. Impact of Islamization on historical consciousness is also evident in the changing landscape of material culture. Many older sites were abandoned, repurposed, or destroyed. Shrines, rock art zones, and tumuli fields were reinterpreted as pagan relics or sites of superstition. Islamic architecture, with its mosques and madrasas, came to dominate the cultural landscape, while non-Islamic artifacts were left to erode. This material transformation reinforced the ideological shift. What remained visible was Islamic. What decayed became forgettable. Moreover, the theological emphasis on tawhid, the oneness of God, and the prohibition of idolatry made many aspects of earlier symbolic systems doctrinally problematic. Anthropomorphic images, animistic practices, and cosmological dualisms were actively suppressed. In some cases, Islamization absorbed certain local customs, reinterpreting them within a monotheistic frame. But in others, the process was one of outright eradication. This was particularly true in more orthodox or reformist movements, such as those associated with the Almoravids or later the Sokoto Caliphate, which actively sought to purify Islam in the region by eliminating syncretic or residual non-Islamic practices. The intellectual consequences of this process were far-reaching. As Arabic became the language of scholarship, administration, and theology, Indigenous languages and their oral literatures were subordinated. Non-Islamic histories, lacking written expression and textual canonization, became harder to transmit and easier to dismiss. Generations grew up without knowledge of their pre-Islamic pasts, not because the knowledge did not exist, but because it had been devalued, forgotten, or rendered heretical. It is important to distinguish between Islam as a faith and Islamization as a historical process. The former offers spiritual and ethical frameworks embraced by millions across the Sahara and beyond. The latter involves the socio-political dynamics by which Islam was adopted, institutionalized, and used to reshape cultural memory. These dynamics included not only genuine religious conviction, but also political expediency, economic integration, and ideological consolidation. The flattening of Saharan history was not an inevitable result of Islam's spiritual teachings, but of the specific ways in which Islamization intersected with power, memory, and historiography. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in exploring the intersections between Islamic and pre-Islamic African histories. Scholars are beginning to examine how Islamic traditions may have preserved fragments of earlier beliefs, and how local expressions of Islam reflect enduring cultural logics. Yet the foundational issue remains: centuries of textual silence have severed the link between modern Saharan societies and their ancient roots. Reconstructing that link requires a critical examination of the process by which Islamization reshaped historical knowledge. It requires acknowledging the losses as well as the gains, the silences as well as the scriptures. It demands an intellectual archaeology of memory, one that digs not only into the sands of the Sahara, but into the archives, libraries, and theological discourses that defined what was worthy of remembrance. Islam did not erase the past, but the way it was institutionalized in the Sahara contributed to a form of historical myopia, one in which the world before Islam became a blank, or worse, a sin. This flattening of memory remains one of the most profound legacies of religious transformation in the region, and one that must be confronted if the deeper strata of Saharan history are ever to be recovered. The artifacts of the ancient Sahara stone tools, ceramics, engravings, metal ornaments, funerary relics lie today in museum drawers and vitrines, scattered across institutions in Europe, North Africa, and beyond. Their surfaces bear the wear of time, but also the marks of an epistemological violence. They have been removed from their landscapes, stripped of their relational context, and inserted into foreign taxonomies. This condition defines what can be called the museum problem, the transformation of archaeological evidence into detached objects, alienated from the systems of knowledge, belief, and ecology that once gave them meaning. During the colonial era, the acquisition of Saharan artifacts was largely opportunistic. European explorers, military officers, and amateur antiquarians collected or looted items from tumuli fields, rock shelters, and ancient settlements. These were transported back to metropoles such as Paris, London, Rome, and Berlin, where they were entered into ethnographic or prehistoric collections, often without adequate provenance. Little effort was made to document find spots, stratigraphy, or associated materials. As a result, even today, many Saharan artifacts in museum collections cannot be reliably dated or placed within a coherent archaeological sequence. This dislocation has serious consequences. Without contextual data such as spatial relationships, environmental setting, or associated organic materials, artifacts lose much of their interpretive power. A grinding stone found in situ, for example, might speak to subsistence strategies, gendered labor, and site organization. In a glass case, labeled simply Stone Implement Fazan region, it becomes an inert object, frozen in ambiguity. This shift from evidence to exhibit reflects a broader transformation, the conversion of cultural material into museum inventory, subject to institutional logics of classification, display, and narrative control. Moreover, the conceptual categories imposed by museums often distort the significance of Saharan artifacts. Items are commonly labeled as Neolithic or prehistoric, without further differentiation. Such terms obscure the cultural specificity of the societies that produced them, flattening centuries of innovation, interaction, and adaptation into a single undifferentiated temporal zone. In many cases, Saharan items are displayed alongside artifacts from entirely different regions, under generic themes like early Africa or desert peoples, reinforcing a perception of the Sahara as timeless and culturally homogeneous. Narratives that accompany these displays frequently reflect outdated assumptions. The Sahara is presented as a marginal zone, its populations as simple, mobile, and environmentally determined. Even in contemporary exhibitions, there is rarely an attempt to connect Saharan material culture with broader patterns of urbanization, trade, or symbolic production. This isolation is not due to a lack of evidence, but to the absence of interpretive frameworks capable of recognizing complexity in non-urban, non-literate contexts. Digital museum catalogs further extend this problem. While many institutions have made strides in digitizing collections, the metadata attached to Saharan artifacts remains minimal. Entries may include a vague location, a broad date range, and a one-line description. Rarely do they include excavation data, cultural affiliation, or references to relevant scholarship. This lack of information is not neutral. It reflects the historical conditions under which these objects were collected, as well as the continuing marginalization of Saharan archaeology and global research agendas. Repatriation debates have brought renewed attention to these issues. African nations have begun to demand the return of cultural property removed during the colonial period. However, the case of the Sahara presents unique challenges. Many artifacts were taken from regions that lack clear national jurisdictions, or from areas that are now politically unstable. Even where return is possible, the absence of conservation infrastructure and academic resources poses obstacles to reintegration. Furthermore, repatriation does not automatically resolve the problem of context. Artifacts returned to museums in Tripoli, Bamako, or Niamey remain decontextualized unless accompanied by comprehensive research, redocumentation, and interpretive reconstruction. The solution to the museum problem lies not only in the physical relocation of objects, but in the reconstruction of their knowledge environments. This requires multidisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists, historians, indigenous communities, and digital technologists to reassemble the social and ecological matrices in which these artifacts were embedded. It also requires a rethinking of museological practice, from static display to dynamic interpretation, from object-centric to context-centric approaches. There are precedents for such efforts. Some museums have initiated provenance research projects aimed at tracing the origin and acquisition history of their Saharan collections. Others have begun to incorporate oral histories, ethnographic analogues, and environmental reconstructions into their exhibitions. A few have partnered with Saharan communities to develop participatory curatorial models, in which local knowledge informs both the interpretation and display of artifacts. These initiatives, though limited in scope, point toward a more ethical and historically responsible museology, yet much remains to be done. The sheer scale of orphaned Saharan artifacts, objects without origin, stories without context demands a systemic response. Academic institutions must prioritize Saharan studies within African archaeology, funding new fieldwork, archival research, and interdisciplinary analysis. Museums must confront their colonial legacies not through token acknowledgments, but through structural reforms in collection management and public engagement. And international bodies must support the creation of Saharan heritage centers that combine conservation, education, and community involvement. The artifacts of the Sahara are not inert remnants of a distant past. They are fragments of disrupted narratives displaced from the landscapes and lifeways that gave them form. Their continued exhibition without context perpetuates a second-order erasure, not the loss of the object itself, but the loss of meaning. To address the museum problem is to recognize that history is not just what is displayed, it is also what is silenced, misclassified, and misunderstood. Only when Saharan artifacts are reconnected to the systems that produced them can they begin to speak, not just to specialists, but to the descendants of those who once held them, and to a global audience long denied the full story of Africa's desert civilizations, one of the most persistent and least acknowledged dynamics in the global historiography of Africa is the unspoken taboo around deep antiquity, particularly that which precedes the Islamic era or lies outside the Nile-centric narrative of Egyptian civilization. Despite increasing archaeological evidence and the rise of African historiography as a field, there remains a systemic resistance to fully integrating pre-Islamic, pre-Egyptian African complexity into the mainstream canon of ancient history. Nowhere is this more evident than in the treatment of the Sahara, whose cultural layers preceding both Islamic and Pharaonic influence remain unexamined or suppressed under layers of scholarly indifference and ideological discomfort. The privileging of Egypt in African antiquity is historically rooted and institutionally reinforced. Egypt's monumental architecture, hieroglyphic script, and connection to biblical and Greco-Roman traditions made it palatable to early European historians and archaeologists. Egypt could be integrated into the classical world without unsettling the racial hierarchies that governed colonial thought. It could be studied as part of the Mediterranean legacy, sanitized of its African context. Meanwhile, other African regions, particularly those without script or surviving monumental cities, were relegated to prehistory, folklore, or anthropological marginalia. This dynamic created a dual problem. First, it detached Egypt from the cultural and ecological matrix of its surroundings, rendering it an anomaly. Second, it established a benchmark for civilization that excluded mobile, symbolic, or non-textual societies. The Sahara, home to some of the oldest human adaptations to arid environments, complex symbolic traditions, and probable early proto-urbanization, was disqualified by these criteria. Its cultures lacked temples, alphabetic scripts, and lasting stone architecture. Therefore, in the eyes of colonial and early post-colonial scholars, they lacked civilizational status. The arrival and spread of Islam further reinforced this erasure. As previously noted, Islamic historiography tends to begin its historical framing with the advent of Islam. This epistemic rupture between the time of ignorance, Jahiliyyah, and the time of revelation creates a theological and cultural disincentive to investigate or valorize pre-Islamic histories. In many parts of North and West Africa, Islamic scholars and institutions promoted historical narratives that foregrounded Islamic conversion, law, and empire while marginalizing indigenous religious systems, rituals, and origin myths. The result was a double exclusion. The Sahara was omitted from the classical narratives of the Mediterranean world, and simultaneously overwritten by the religious historiographies of Islam, pre-Islamic and pre-Egyptian. Layers were left unclaimed by both dominant paradigms. This created what might be termed an intellectual vacuum, wherein the earliest civilizational trajectories of the Sahara were either treated as unknowable or dismissed as irrelevant. Modern scholarship has begun to challenge these paradigms, but the taboo persists in subtler forms. Funding for archaeological research in Saharan zones is disproportionately low compared to Egyptological or Islamic studies. Heritage institutions in African countries often focus on Islamic manuscripts, colonial resistance narratives, or folkloric preservation, while neglecting the material remains of older, non-Islamic societies. Academic curricula, even in African universities, rarely include structured study of Saharan prehistory. In the public imagination, there's little awareness that the Sahara once hosted cultures with astronomy, architecture, ritual complexity, and trans-regional networks. This absence is not a reflection of actual evidence. Sites such as Nabda Playa, Tichet Walata, and Jerma provide ample data on early planning, social organization, and symbolic systems. The rock art of Tassili Najar and Endi, depicting processions, animal domestication, and ritual scenes, is arguably one of the richest visual corpuses of prehistoric humanity. The tumuli fields of Niger, Chad, and southern Libya rival those of megalithic Europe in scale and number. Yet these sites remain largely uncontextualized in the global narrative of human development. Their chronology does not intersect with the biblical or classical timelines that shaped early historiography, and their cultural forms do not conform to the architectural or textual benchmarks preferred by traditional archaeologists. In many academic circles, there remains an implicit hierarchy of evidence. Script and monumental architecture are considered the apex of civilizational expression. Oral tradition, symbolic systems, or ephemeral structures are treated as secondary, if not outright inferior. This hierarchy is deeply Eurocentric and was shaped by the cultural models of 19th century Europe, where the nation-state, the archive, and the monument were foundational to historical legitimacy. African societies that developed alternative models, mobile social structures, environmental adaptation, symbolic spatial practices are thus rendered invisible by a methodology that cannot recognize their complexity. The consequences of this invisibility are profound. The notion that Africa has no history before Egypt or Islam is still commonly held, both within and outside the continent. This notion underpins broader assumptions about African development, political capacity, and cultural depth. It feeds into global narratives that depict Africa as reactive rather than generative, as a continent whose history begins with contact from outside, whether through conquest, trade, or missionary activity. The Sahara's deep past, if properly understood, would challenge this paradigm. It would demonstrate that complexity, innovation, and symbolic thought emerged in Africa independently and early, not merely as responses to external stimuli. The taboo of pre-Islamic and pre-Egyptian Africa requires more than empirical correction. It demands a shift in historical method and imagination. Scholars must move beyond the fixation on script and stone and engage seriously with the forms of memory, knowledge, and order that operated outside these media. African institutions must invest in heritage infrastructures that prioritize the preservation and study of prehistoric sites. International bodies must revise museum practices, research priorities, and educational standards to reflect the full temporal depth of African history. Perhaps most importantly, this process requires confronting the ideological foundations of historical exclusion. The marginalization of early Saharan complexity was not accidental. It served specific colonial, theological, and epistemological functions. By restoring these lost layers to the narrative, we not only correct the record, we also dismantle the structures of thought that made their erasure possible. The Sahara's forgotten civilizations are not merely lost in the sand. They are buried beneath assumptions about what counts as history, about where civilization begins, and about who has the right to be remembered. To lift this taboo is not simply to recover a past, but to transform the framework in which all pasts are understood. The past decade has witnessed a technological shift in archaeological research, one that is particularly transformative for environments like the Sahara, where traditional excavation is constrained by geography, climate, and logistics. Satellite imagery, remote sensing, and geospatial analysis now allow archaeologists to peer beneath the sands, revealing anomalies and patterns invisible from the ground. These technologies are not only extending the frontier of discovery, they are reconfiguring the methods by which lost histories are reconstructed. In the context of the Sahara, satellite archaeology holds the potential to overturn centuries of accumulated erasure. Remote sensing technologies, such as multispectral and hyperspectral imaging, radar, and LiDAR allow researchers to detect differences in soil composition, vegetation density, and surface texture. These variations often indicate the presence of buried structures, ancient paths, or subsurface anomalies. In regions like Egypt, Sudan, and the Near East, such methods have already uncovered previously unknown settlements, fortifications, and hydraulic systems. Their application to the Sahara is still in its early stages, but the initial results are both striking and consequential. In southern Libya, satellite imagery has revealed long linear depressions consistent with Fougera irrigation systems, subterranean channels engineered by the Garamantes and their predecessors. These structures are difficult to identify from the ground, as erosion and collapse have obscured their surface indicators. Yet when viewed from above, their alignment, spacing, and orientation become clear. Hundreds of such features have been mapped, suggesting a level of infrastructural density that belies the conventional image of the Sahara as sparsely inhabited. Elsewhere, in Algeria and Mali, researchers have used imagery to identify circular enclosures, trackways, and rectilinear features likely associated with pasturage, ceremonial spaces, or settlement boundaries. Some of these features extend for kilometers, their geometric precision suggesting deliberate planning rather than natural formation. In Mauritania's Tichet Walata zone, satellite analysis has helped clarify the spatial organization of stone-walled settlements, revealing orthogonal layouts and clusters that suggest neighborhood-like groupings. The ability to detect such features without excavation is crucial in a region where political instability, remoteness, and environmental degradation make traditional fieldwork sporadic and dangerous. It also provides a strategic advantage. Archaeologists can prioritize high-probability sites for limited ground investigations, maximizing the impact of constrained funding and labor resources. In effect, satellite archaeology functions as a filter, enabling scholars to read the terrain as a text one composed of shadows, traces, and residual geometries. These techniques are not limited to detection. By combining satellite data with historical maps, ethnographic records, and environmental models, researchers can reconstruct paleo landscapes, the ancient configuration of rivers, lakes, vegetation zones, and climate parameters. For the Sahara, this means identifying where people could have lived, migrated, and cultivated during the African humid period. The integration of geomorphological data, such as fossilized riverbeds and former lake basins, has enabled the modeling of ancient ecologies in which prehistoric societies thrived. One particularly fruitful area of study has been the identification of trans-Saharan routes. Satellite imagery has uncovered worn corridors, sometimes marked by cairns or stone alignments that align with historical trade paths known from oral tradition or classical sources. These routes, now obscured by sand or development, once served as arteries of exchange between North Africa and the Sahel. Their visibility from space challenges the notion that the Sahara was a barrier to movement. It shows instead a continent of interconnectivity, sustained by knowledge systems adapted to arid mobility. Despite these advances, the use of satellite archaeology in the Sahara faces several challenges. First, the interpretation of imagery is fraught with ambiguity. Not every anomaly indicates human activity. Natural processes such as wind erosion, rock fracturing, or animal trails can produce patterns that mimic anthropogenic features. Ground truthing remains essential, but in many cases is impossible due to conflict or remoteness. This raises a methodological issue: how to distinguish signal from noise in a terrain where both are abundant. Second, the democratization of satellite data poses issues of stewardship and control. High-resolution imagery is increasingly accessible to private researchers, amateurs, and commercial entities. While this has opened new avenues for discovery, it also increases the risk of site looting, unauthorized excavation, and cultural appropriation. Without regulatory frameworks, sensitive data about archaeological sites can be misused, contributing to the destruction rather than preservation of Saharan heritage. Third, there is a persistent gap between technological capability and institutional response. Many Saharan countries lack the resources, personnel, or legal structures to act upon the discoveries made through satellite analysis. Even when potential sites are identified, follow-up research is rare. Museums and universities often remain focused on better-known or more easily accessible regions. In this sense, the technological revolution has outpaced the academic and political infrastructure needed to support it. Nevertheless, the transformative potential of satellite archaeology remains undeniable. It offers a non-invasive, scalable, and cost-effective means of mapping the deep history of the Sahara. It enables the identification of sites that would otherwise remain unknown and allows for the integration of the desert into broader models of African and global prehistory. It shifts the focus from isolated artifacts to settlement systems, from isolated inscriptions to landscape-level analysis. Perhaps most importantly, it enables the reinscription of the Sahara into historical consciousness. The desert, long depicted as a void, is being revealed as a palimpsest, a surface overwritten by time, yet retaining the indelible marks of human presence. The ability to read those marks from above, to reconstruct forgotten topographies and track the pathways of vanished peoples is not merely a technical achievement. It is a methodological rebuke to centuries of neglect. In this new archaeology, the satellite becomes a corrective lens, one that brings into focus the overlooked, the erased, and the denied. It affirms that the past is not irretrievable, even when buried under kilometers of sand. What is needed now is not just the technology to see, but the will to interpret, to protect, and to remember. The recovery of Saharan antiquity has been hampered not only by the erosion of time and the forces of desertification, but by the structure of modern knowledge itself. The academic disciplines responsible for reconstructing the past, archaeology, history, climatology, anthropology, linguistics, genetics, have each developed with their own methodologies, epistemologies, and institutional cultures. While this specialization has yielded precision in individual domains, it has also erected barriers to synthesis. The story of the Sahara, which spans environmental shifts, mobile societies, symbolic systems, and non-linear trajectories, cannot be understood within a single disciplinary frame. Yet the scholarly world remains compartmentalized, producing fragments rather than wholes. Archaeologists have provided detailed data on sites, artifacts, and stratigraphy, yet often operate independently of climatologists whose paleohydrological reconstructions are essential to understanding settlement viability. Linguists have traced migration patterns and language families across North Africa and the Sahel, but rarely engage with geneticists mapping population movement through DNA. Historians continue to prioritize textual sources, marginalizing regions and epochs that lack written records. The result is a fragmented landscape of insights, each illuminating in isolation but incapable of generating a coherent account of Saharan civilization. The disciplinary silos are reinforced by institutional incentives. Academic careers are built on specialization. Funding agencies prioritize narrowly defined projects with measurable outputs. Journals, peer reviewers, and promotion committees all reward methodological rigor within established boundaries. Interdisciplinary work, by contrast, is often seen as diffuse, speculative, or methodologically impure. Scholars who attempt to bridge fields must navigate incompatible terminologies, publication venues, and epistemic standards. In the context of the Sahara, where data is sparse and interpretive risks are high. This conservatism becomes a form of gatekeeping, an intellectual refusal to connect the dots. Moreover, different disciplines operate on different timescales. Archaeologists may work with periods spanning millennia, climatologists with even longer epochs, while historians often confine their scope to centuries or decades. These temporal mismatches make it difficult to align narratives. For example, a drying event dated by climatologists of 4200 BCE may correlate with archaeological evidence of site abandonment, but historians lack the documentary sources to confirm causality. Without mechanisms for integrating disparate chronologies, the larger picture remains speculative or incomplete. Epistemologically, the challenge is even deeper. Different fields ask different kinds of questions and assign different weights to different forms of evidence. In archaeology, an isolated artifact can suggest a hypothesis. In history, a single document can reshape interpretation. But climatological models are probabilistic, linguistic reconstructions are inferential, and genetic data is statistical. The thresholds for certainty vary, as do the tolerance levels for ambiguity. In the case of the Sahara, where evidence is often fragmentary or non-replicable, these differences become fault lines. One field's tentative pattern is another's unverified claim. This epistemic divergence is particularly damaging when it comes to recognizing forms of complexity outside conventional models. Societies without writing, cities, or metallurgy are often excluded from the category of civilization, despite exhibiting sophisticated symbolic, ecological, or social systems. These alternative complexities fall between disciplinary cracks. Anthropologists may recognize them in terms of cultural expression, but historians find them non-verifiable. Archaeologists may document their material residues, but avoid theorizing their structural implications. The result is an impoverished understanding, not because the data is absent, but because no one is synthesizing it into meaningful narrative frameworks. Attempts at interdisciplinarity often fall into tokenism. A paper may include a section on environmental context or linguistic background, but these are rarely integrated into the analytical core. True interdisciplinarity requires co-production of knowledge, joint problem definition, shared methodology, and iterative interpretation. It requires new institutional structures, research centers that unite climatologists with oral historians, geneticists with ethnographies, and archaeologists with semioticians. It requires funding models that support slow, collaborative work, rather than rapid individual publication. And it requires intellectual humility, an acknowledgement that no single field has privileged access to the truth of the past. Some initiatives have moved in this direction. Projects such as the Trans-Sahara Research Network or the Sahara Megalithic Survey have brought together specialists across disciplines and nations. Conferences, collaborative excavations, and open access data repositories have begun to bridge the silos. Digital platforms now allow for the integration of satellite data, archaeological site reports, and linguistic corpora. These efforts, however, remain the exception rather than the norm. Institutional inertia, disciplinary territorialism, and funding constraints continue to limit their scope and impact. The limitations of current knowledge production are also geopolitical. Much of the research on Saharan prehistory is conducted by institutions in the global north, with limited participation from scholars based in the Sahara-adjacent regions themselves. This asymmetry reinforces epistemic dependency and limits the incorporation of local perspectives, oral traditions, and indigenous epistemologies. Interdisciplinarity must also be decolonial structured to include knowledge systems that do not conform to Western academic norms but hold value in reconstructing alternative pasts. Ultimately, the Sahara challenges the disciplines because it refuses to conform to their expectations. Its civilizations were not always centralized, literate, or monumentally expressed. Its complexity was often ecological, symbolic, and mobile. To understand it requires a methodological shift, from seeking linear narratives to mapping relational networks, from privileging permanence to valuing adaptation, from isolating variables to integrating systems. The disciplines, as currently structured, are not well suited to this task. What is needed is not the abandonment of specialization, but its reconfiguration. Scholars must be trained not only in their methods, but in the limits of those methods. They must be encouraged to read across fields, to co-author with researchers from other domains, and to design questions that cannot be answered from within a single tradition. The Sahara offers both a problem and an opportunity, a zone of historical silence that can be approached only through intellectual cooperation. The failure to reconstruct Saharan antiquity is not due to lack of technology, data, or interest. It is due to the architecture of modern knowledge, a structure built for depth, not breadth, for precision, not synthesis. If the Sahara is to be remembered, that structure must be changed. The future of its past depends on it. If the Sahara's historical obscurity is not the product of absence, but of selective silence and epistemological fragmentation, then the task ahead is not merely one of discovery, but of reconstruction, a critical reconstruction that interrogates how knowledge of the Sahara has been made, distorted, and constrained. To approach this problem requires more than new data. It demands a new historiographical framework, one that integrates multiple forms of evidence, recognizes alternative models of complexity, and resists the ideological forces that have rendered the Sahara an intellectual periphery. This is the foundation of a critical Saharan historiography. At its core, this approach begins by rejecting the chronological exceptionalism that situates Africa's history as beginning with external contact, whether through Egypt, Islam, or Europe. It affirms that Africa had its own temporalities of development, its own internal trajectories of transformation, and its own expressions of symbolic and social complexity that are not derivations or deviations from elsewhere. This requires writing history without the crutch of script, without the bias for monumentality, and without the linear models of rise and fall derived from Eurasian state histories. Of critical Saharan historiography privileges ecology as an active historical agent. Rather than treating climate as a passive background, it places environmental fluctuation at the center of human adaptation, innovation, and collapse. The Holocene humid phase and its eventual reversal did not merely frame Saharan history, they structured it. Mobility, transhumance, oasis agriculture, and hydraulic engineering were responses to, and manifestations of, these ecological rhythms. Understanding the Sahara's past therefore necessitates the integration of paleoclimate data, hydrological models, and geomorphological studies into the historical narrative. The human story here is not told against nature, but with it, equally. Such a historiography must treat mobility not as a marker of primitiveness, but as a sophisticated strategy of survival and complexity. Nomadic and semi-nomadic societies in the Sahara were not chaotic or disorganized. They possessed territorial logics, seasonal rhythms, and intricate social systems capable of coordinating labor, ritual, and exchange across vast distances. Their settlements were often impermanent, but their cultural systems were durable. To equate permanence with advancement is to misunderstand the adaptive intelligence required to thrive in extreme environments. A critical approach also demands the elevation of symbolic and ritual systems as primary historical evidence. In the absence of written records, rock art, burial customs, and architectural alignments are not ornamental, they are repositories of worldview. These material expressions must be read not as decorative, but as communicative, encoding relationships to time, space, ancestry, and the cosmos. Interpreting them requires collaboration between archaeologists, anthropologists, art historians, and practitioners of comparative religion. It also necessitates a shift in evidentiary standards, recognizing that meaning can be derived from pattern, placement, and context, even when linguistic translation is impossible. Language itself becomes a historical source in this framework, not in the form of texts, but in the deep structures of linguistic families and the echoes of migration and contact embedded in grammar and vocabulary. The Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, and Niger-Congo language groups intersect across the Saharan corridor, revealing ancient interactions between communities. Historical linguistics, when cross-referenced with genetic and archaeological data, can help map the movements and contacts that have shaped the region's demographic history. The integration of genetic evidence must be similarly cautious and critical. Rather than seeking pure lineages or discrete populations, a critical historiography recognizes hybridity, admixture, and demographic fluidity as normative. The Sahara was a zone of crossing, not containment. Its peoples moved, mingled, and reconstituted themselves across generations. Genetic signals, like linguistic ones, are markers of interaction, not isolation. Their interpretation must be embedded within broader cultural and environmental context to avoid reductive or deterministic conclusions. One of the most urgent dimensions of a critical Saharan historiography is its political consciousness. It acknowledges that the suppression of Saharan history served specific colonial, theological, and academic interests. It interrogates the structures, museums, universities, textbooks that have curated and maintained that suppression. And it insists on the importance of authorship. Who writes Saharan history? Who frames the questions? Who gets to decide what counts as evidence? This demands the inclusion of voices from Saharan communities themselves, Tuareg, Tavu, Fulani, Songhai, and others whose oral traditions, spatial knowledge, and cultural memory preserve fragments of the past that the Academy has ignored. It also calls for investment in local institutions, universities, museums, heritage centers, and research programs based in the Sahara and led by scholars from the region. Decolonizing Saharan historiography is not merely a moral imperative. It is a methodological necessity. Digital tools can support this transformation, but they must be wielded with care. Databases of satellite imagery, digitized museum collections, and open-access publications should be designed not just for academic use, but for community engagement and collaborative knowledge production. Participatory mapping, citizen archaeology, and multilingual documentation can democratize the reconstruction process and ensure that Saharan history is not written over again by external authorities. Finally, a critical Saharan historiography must embrace uncertainty. The evidence is fragmentary, the timelines fluid, the interpretations contested. But ambiguity is not an argument for inaction. It is a call for humility, rigor, and creative synthesis. Historical reconstruction is never the recovery of a perfect original. It is always a negotiation between what remains and what can be responsibly inferred. The Sahara's past will not yield itself easily. Its traces are scattered, eroded, and buried. But they are not gone. They await a different kind of inquiry, one that sees beyond the desert as absence and toward the desert as archive. The civilizations that once flourished in the Sahara before its desiccation have left behind no epic texts, no sprawling ruins in stone, and no dynastic lists etched in monumental relief. Yet the absence of those conventional markers does not signify insignificance. What was lost with the collapse of the Green Sahara was not only a series of human settlements, but a vast, interconnected system of adaptation, symbolic expression, ecological management, and cultural innovation that challenges the very criteria by which history has long been written. The silence that overlays this lost world is not natural. It has been constructed through climate, ideology, and epistemic structures. The imperative to recover its traces is not just academic. It is civilizational. This investigation has shown that the Sahara was once green, inhabited, and culturally vibrant. From the cattle cults of prehistoric pastoralists to the urban ingenuity of the Garamantes, from the ritual alignments of megalithic monuments to the scattered fragments of symbolic proto-writing, the evidence points to a deep time complexity that defies the image of the desert as a void. These societies developed in tune with their environment, responded dynamically to ecological stress, and interacted across vast distances through systems of trade, ritual, and knowledge that remained largely undocumented, but no less real. What was lost then is not simply a civilization in the singular. It was a way of being in the world that left few monumental scars, but many distributed impressions. Its memory was not recorded in stone texts but in movement patterns, in oral cosmologies, in spatial design, in symbolic abstraction. These forms of knowledge transmission were more vulnerable to interruption. When the environment collapsed and the epistemic violence of later empires, religions, and colonial regimes took hold, these histories became unrecoverable through conventional means. But to understand why this loss matters, one must confront the historiographical logic that allowed it to occur and to persist. Historical importance has long been measured by visibility, by what can be excavated, translated, monumentalized, and cataloged. This has excluded vast zones of human experience, especially those in mobile, adaptive, or symbolic forms. The Sahara, with its traditions of ecological intelligence, symbolic abstraction, and infrastructural subtlety, confounds this model. Its civilizations were not less than their riverine or urban counterparts. They were different, and that difference was never afforded equal intellectual dignity. The loss also matters because it reveals the limitations of dominant civilizational narratives, those that prioritize linear progress, centralized authority, and technological display. In doing so, these narratives marginalize societies that thrive through decentralization, environmental synergy, and cultural plurality. The Sahara's forgotten past invites us to reconsider our frameworks, to accept that civilization may reside in pastoral calendars and ritual landscapes as much as in temples and codes of law. It urges a recalibration of what historical sophistication looks like. This is not a call for romanticism. The cultures of the Green Sahara faced hardship, collapse, and displacement. Their adaptability did not shield them from environmental thresholds or historical contingency. But neither were they primitive precursors waiting to be uplifted. They were contemporaneous experiments in human organization, and their disappearance has left a gap not only in Africa's deep history, but in humanity's understanding of its own diversity. The loss matters too because it continues to shape the present. The Saharan void is a political artifact as much as a historiographical one. The marginalization of Saharan histories has reinforced the marginalization of Saharan peoples. Tuareg, Taboo, and other desert communities are often treated as relics of the past rather than inheritors of ancient knowledge systems. The denial of historical depth contributes to the denial of political legitimacy. It fuels narratives of dispossession, statelessness, and expendability. To recover Saharan history is thus not just to restore the past, but to challenge contemporary hierarchies of power, memory, and recognition. Moreover, the Saharan collapse offers lessons for the Anthropocene. These societies lived within fragile ecological equilibria and developed cultural systems to manage scarcity, mobility, and risk. Their collapse reminds us that environmental change is not just a background condition, it is a civilizational force. And their resilience reminds us that alternatives to extractive, sedentary models of growth have existed and can be reimagined. What was lost may also point toward what must be remembered in order to survive the future. The question of why this history was forgotten is inseparable from the question of who benefits from its forgetting. The Sahara was erased from maps not because nothing happened there, but because what happened there did not conform to the paradigms that structured global knowledge. Colonialism found the desert useful as a blank canvas. Empires saw it as a frontier. Even modern scholarship has often reproduced the desert's invisibility, focusing on its margins rather than its core. Reintegrating the Sahara into the historical imagination requires an active epistemic disobedience, a willingness to write history without the comfort of texts, without the guarantee of monumental proof, and without the security of consensus. It demands faith in traces, fragments, and the plausibility of patterns across disciplines. It demands that we privilege the questions that remain unanswered over those that confirm what is already known. Ultimately, the lost civilizations of the Sahara matter because they testify to the plurality of human pathways. They are reminders that complexity is not a singular line, but a web, that progress is not inevitable, but contingent, and that silence is not always the absence of meaning, but the outcome of its suppression. What was lost was a world vast, adaptive, symbolic, and unfinished. What remains is a responsibility, to see in the desert not emptiness, but a challenge. A challenge to remember differently, to reconstruct rigorously, and to listen more carefully to the lands that history has made quiet,